An outline of the origins of money. 1. Anthropology and economics. The natural monetary system. If anthropology has the task to provide all related and already developed sciences with a broader and more solid foundation for their theories, then it must also review the doctrines of economics, either to better support them, reshape them based on deeper insights, or discard them altogether. This task is not always easy. Whoever resides on the top floors of a gleaming building is reluctant to inquire about the integrity of the base and the lower walls, and the anthropologist tapping at the foundations with a hammer is seen as a bothersome nuisance. It is far more rewarding to continue to add new towers and stories than to admit that the whole structure rests on shaky ground, or even to descend and, far from the noise and applause above, repair the faulty walls. The history of money is one of the most instructive examples of the relationship between anthropology and a closely related science, insofar as this history is written by economists. Following a good old custom, they almost exclusively rely on the records of ancient and modern civilized people which are considered unequivocally typical for humanity. On this alarmingly narrow basis, the most reckless theories then shoot up into the heavens, and men of gold and silver preach their wisdom from dizzying heights to an astonished people. Amidst their noise, the request of anthropology to broaden the research base will certainly go unnoticed at first, but it will, finally, have to be heard when bewilderment can no longer be resolved in any other way, and truth instead of warring interests is once again allowed to have a say. Anthropology must also, for its own advantage, preoccupy itself with the questions of the origins and development of the monetary system, because although the concept of money, as we currently use it, is a cultural achievement, its uncritical application to simpler contexts has caused all sorts of unfortunate misunderstandings, especially in travel accounts. As the term concept has come up, it should be pointed out decisively that a work belonging to the field of anthropology can never involve the razor-sharp conceptual definitions that are commonly assumed to be the goal of all research in those sciences influenced by jurisprudence. Such definitions easily hinder insight into the course of development. Whether we want to use the term money to refer to the early beginnings of what we now call money, or whether we give it some other name, is thoroughly irrelevant with respect to the actual problem concerning us as long as we remain aware of the fact that all rigid designations cannot do justice to the flow of development, and are thus nothing but superficial aids for anthropology. This remark may appear redundant for those familiar with anthropological thinking, but the number of those who expect salvation from the dissection of concepts instead of the impartial observation of the continuous flux of becoming and passing away is unfortunately all too large. And so let it be said once again that the question here is not what do we understand by money but a completely different one. From which origins did money develop and which stages of this development can still be traced? Only indigenous peoples can provide us with the answer to this question. It cannot be claimed that anthropologists have already devoted special attention to this question. From a proper anthropological standpoint, only one person has addressed the problem, namely Richard Andre in a section of his ethnographic parallels, which has paved the way for many questions by applying the comparative method with rare diligence, and which therefore deserves forever to hold a praiseworthy position in the history of anthropology. The first thing Andre had to establish was a simple and clear classification of the tremendous amount of material, and he did so by sorting the different monetary instruments into specific sets according to their material by subsuming them under the terms stone money, shell money, cloth money, iron money, salt money, and so on. In doing so, a preliminary overview was achieved. Shortly after, but independent of Andre, Franz Eulhoff dealt with the problem in his text Barter and Money Substitutes. His work represents an improvement over Andre, as it attempts to rely on ethnographic findings to improve economic doctrines. Unfortunately, the ethnographic part of the essay is the weakest, even though new concepts should arise from a sound ethnographic basis. Consequently, the impact of his otherwise commendable work has remained limited. Merely for the sake of completeness, we mention Oscar Lentz's essay on money among primitive people, which closely follows Andre, but offers nothing new apart from some noteworthy observations about African conditions. It is high time now to pursue the problem of the development of money, which has been noticeably neglected since then. What can be offered here is, of course, little more than a sketch, but it might still illustrate that the conceptual disputes of today have been present from the beginning. I do not intend to approach these questions here, However, a deeper understanding of the current state of things is impossible without possessing knowledge of the simpler, older forms. The goal of this treatise is, therefore, to offer a reliable foundation. Just as we cannot know the living conditions of a plant by contemplating its leaves and flowers while ignoring its roots, we cannot hope to find the real sources of the influences that shape and transform economic life up to the present day without the help of anthropology. At the very least, it will become apparent that the economist's truism about the consecutive stages of barter, money, and credit economies does not remotely do justice to the real problems, and that alone is a step forward that inevitably will be followed by others over time. Anthropology relies on laws applicable in many instances, and knowledge of these laws can even point us to answers to newly emerged questions. The first and best known of these laws teaches us that a new custom or institution never emerges out of nothing, but that beginnings and seeds are ever present and have to operate secretly for long before more ideal forms emerge. It is therefore reasonable to assume that the concept of money has also undergone a long development. Moreover, ethnographic experience allows us to firmly reject the preconception that institutions arise from purposeful contemplations alone. We are familiar with cultural concepts such as religion, the state, justice, and so on, which nowadays appear unified but, on closer inspection, prove to be put together and artificially fused, and we know that in such cases, the concept often tends to be a confluence of very different sources, and that we can still observe these individual sources separately among indigenous peoples. What we now call money is also an illusory unity. Even a cursory observation reveals that money can serve as a measure of value or as a medium that stores the results of all kinds of work, like an electrical battery or energy accumulator does with various mechanical forces, while it, in the form of fines and taxes, performs purely social tasks, and is also used as a universally welcomed means of exchange that greatly facilitates commercial transactions from person to person, and from nation to nation. If we search among indigenous peoples for traces of these various properties of money, we not only find them separate in completely recognizable form, but we are also made aware of how all the currents that became unified in the concept of money are tightly connected to the historical development of humanity itself. Parallel facts often make it easier to quickly understand a phenomenon than many words, and in our case, such a parallel can be seen in the historical development of marriage. The particular relation between a man and a woman that we now call marriage has developed in quite different ways, depending on whether it took shape within a tribe, endogamy, or as a result of hostile and later friendly relations with other hordes and tribes, exogamy. Only civilized peoples have arrived at a more or less unified idea. The concept of money has arisen in a similar way, originating from two distinct sources. What functions as the foundation of wealth and measure of value for property and serves social ends within a tribe is, in its origins, something entirely different from the means of exchange that travels from tribe to tribe and eventually transforms itself, as a universally welcomed commodity, into a kind of currency. To acknowledge this difference from the very beginning, we ask to use, provisionally for want of better terms, inside money for the first kinds of primitive monies, and outside money for the second. Obviously, this classification initially seems to have nothing to do with the purely material one used by André. However, as this enquiry proceeds to show, there is no necessary contradiction between the two. 2. The beginnings of property, measure of value and valuable property, the origin of inside money. One cannot conceive of the beginnings and earliest seeds of money within a human community unless personal property has emerged alongside an original, all-encompassing communal ownership. Even today, here and there, this development has not progressed significantly, and within the family, the last form of consanguine solidarity in primitive societies, remnants of an ancient communism are still alive, and a sharp delineation of individual property is only partially realized. The study of the emergence of private property among indigenous peoples has been, unfortunately and undeservedly, neglected, and existing discussions on the subject mainly concern property rights in land. These, however, develop much later and in entirely different ways than claims of ownership over movable goods or living beings. Moreover, one continually encounters the theoretical error that the individual is primarily and above all attracted to useful things which he seeks to withdraw from common ownership. The opposite is true. Objects of practical use, and especially food, are the last to become indisputable property. In fact, the universally prevailing assumption is that everyone has a right to these things, and those who accumulate them in excess should therefore share them with the needy of their tribe without receiving further thanks or compensation. Whenever members of civilized societies are transferred to simple and primitive conditions, such as the first settlers of the jungle or the prairie, a kind of communal property that encompasses all practical and useful things quickly emerges and only disappears once the option to buy food, tools, and the like arises nearby. Attitudes of this kind can be found among most indigenous peoples, and the ideals of the galactophagy of antiquity, in which everything except their weaponry was common property, still have their parallels today. Drawing on a small sample from different parts of the world may suffice. On the Tonga Islands, according to mariners' testimony, everyone was allowed to enter any house at mealtime and partake in the meal, and nothing aroused the indignant astonishment of some Tongans taken to Sydney more than the fact that no one there invited them to a meal. Among the Mongol tribes, all edible items were practically a common good. Everyone shared what they had with the greatest generosity, while other possessions and livestock were only reluctantly given away. According to Liechtenstein's report, anyone could participate in the chief's meals among the Corsa, and wherever a cow was slaughtered, it was taken for granted that anyone who happened to be in the area could join the feast without a special invitation. Enderman reports of the Sutu in Transvaal. This custom is often uncomfortable for the European. If he has Sutu workers and they sit down to eat, it is their habit to allow anyone passing by to eat with them. They cannot comprehend that the employer does not readily want to permit this, because otherwise he would incur losses. Gusfeld also praises the Longo Africans for their willingness to share their food with each other, in the custom prevalent in the Orient, and even in Spain, of at least formally inviting onlookers to partake in a meal. A remnant of this communism is still alive. One of the most alluring images is how the personality of an individual asserts itself, bit by bit, against the overpowering clan and tribal community, partly by achieving an internal autonomy of character and ideas, and partly by creating a zone of influence around itself and impressing its essence as a stamp on people as well as things in various ways. Those objects that individuals affect and reshape with their own will are indeed the beginning of their personal property. The shapes of tools and weapons, as invented by the human hand, reflect an individual's inner being. They are a part of his essence and therefore belong to him in a completely different way than a fruit plucked from a tree, or a hunted animal struck down by an arrow. When Rudder says, labor establishes between man and the objects which he has transformed a far closer connection than mere appropriation, he fails to capture the basic feature of the phenomenon, because it is not bare physical labor which is decisive, as it can also accompany simple appropriation, but rather the mental engagement with the object, which finds its outward expression only when form is transformed through physical labor. How mystical imaginations forge an even tighter bond between humans and their works has been incisively pointed out by Karl Butcher. The product of labor, he says, is, as it were, a part of the person producing it. The man who transfers it to another alienates a part of his being and subjects himself to the evil powers. Fundamentally, the first thing that a person becomes aware of as personal property is his own body, and from this it follows that, at the earliest stage, everything meant to alter or adorn the body is also perceived as private property. Hair, artfully matted with clay, can certainly not be claimed from its owner by any fellow tribe member, but neither can the wooden comb, which has been carved out and stays nestled in the hair, be easily taken by someone else. Anyone desiring it must either politely ask for it or decide to reciprocate with a counter-gift. Adornments thus become the earliest personal possessions, and this is true not only for ornaments on one's body. Decorated tools and weapons, created by unique tastes and caprice, have property-bestowing powers as well. Ornaments can easily turn into proprietary marks, and since they often allude to mystical ideas, their owners simultaneously derive an intimate value from them, just as jewelry transforms easily into protective or magical amulets. If we also consider that quite a few ornaments serve as memories of individual heroic deeds in war or hunting, we have a multitude of converging motives that explain why the first rights of ownership extended to bodily adornments and to weapons and tools decorated by human hands. In some places, there has been no progress beyond this stage of development. Martius says about the natives in Brazil, with regards to private property, similar to our ancestors' view of a man's weaponry and a woman's dowry, men keep their weapons and ornaments, while women view their jewelry and garments, if they own any, as their own. Those are merely adornments for them. All other things, hammocks, pottery, flower-making tools, and the like, are considered family property. This is also the case elsewhere, and women often know how to defend their rights with great determination. A woman from Test Island, New Guinea, attacked her husband with a stick because he had secretly traded away her jewelry to the Europeans, and made him hand over the piece of hoop iron he had received in return. It is particularly intriguing to observe how the property of women, generally established more slowly and later than that of men, first and often exclusively encompasses adornments, which, bypassing men, are passed down female inheritance lines, regardless of whether they are made of the most precious and desired materials that tempt the envy of male heirs. Among the Arabs of the Sahara, this custom is so common that many women possess considerable assets in the form of gold and silver jewelry. The same custom is attested to on the Polynesian island of Nauru. According to Jung, the items of worth brought in by the woman are her jewelry and other treasures. Upon her death, these are always inherited by the eldest daughter, and if there is no daughter in the family, these items are buried or sunk into the sea beyond the reef. Pedrick reports similar things about the Dinka on the Upper Nile. What individuals transform for themselves, what they, in other words, set aside from the common property by imprinting onto it a part of their being, initially holds a specific value for them alone, which entirely depends on the owner's whims and generally does not correspond to the object's function or utility. Yet, even this capricious appreciation largely stems from the influence of tribesmen who, while refraining from claiming these personal possessions, still co-determine their value through their judgments. When a young man crafts a piece of shell jewelry, he certainly does not aim to delight in it just by himself, but rather seeks to incite the envy of his fellows and the admiration of women, and, if he succeeds, the ornament gains a high value for him. However, this value can suddenly plummet to zero if someone else captivates everyone's attention through a more original design. This is similar to the way in which a child clings to a toy one moment and carelessly tosses it aside the next, and as we are actually dealing with the products of a playful artistic drive, a resemblance that is noteworthy, especially in its early stages. Private property is thus most strongly subjected to the judgment of fellow members of the tribe, and so naturally finds itself becoming an object of desire for those who highly esteem it. In this way transfers of property are animated, through gift-giving, plunder, thievery, or exchange. Desired possessions can pass from hand to hand, although this does not exactly lead to a well-regulated form of profit-orientated exchange. Initially more significant is another effect of general approval. One might refuse the idea of taking objects from their owner in whichever way, but the idea embodied in the ornament or instrument is not protected by a patent against copying, and so, as long as the necessary materials are available, anyone can recreate the much desired object in a similar form. The human mimetic drive kicks in. From then on, the value of certain possessions is established by the more conservative inclinations of the whole tribe, rather than by the fluctuating whims of the individual. While some items appear in fleeting fashions only to disappear again, others become a stable, or at least only gradually changing, custom. The abundance of bodily adornments thus gradually disaggregates into two large groups. The first encompasses types of adornments that are individually or even collectively popular at a given moment but are subject to the varying judgments of taste. The second, on the other hand, includes the few things that escape the changes of fashion and, to some extent, become the fixed insignias of the tribe. This latter type forms the foundation of inside money, as its long-lasting and uniform appreciation makes it suitable to act as a measure of value. Once this foundation has been laid, the concept of wealth begins to develop. In completely primitive circumstances, an individual can neither acquire land nor will he profit from accumulating food supplies and other useful objects. In contrast, amassing ornamental objects has no boundaries, particularly among sedentary tribes who are not compelled to carry their property around. Due to these objects' material nature, the tendency to continuously amass them can barely be kept within reasonable limits. Everyone avoids senselessly hoarding food that cannot be entirely consumed and ultimately goes to waste. In contrast, adornments persist indefinitely, and the prospect of covering oneself with one piece today and another tomorrow opens unlimited and enticing prospects for the future. Nothing else is needed to activate the hoarding drive, whose irresistible power also manifests in innumerable other phenomena and plays a profoundly significant role in the development of money. Once some types of adornment are widely appreciated, the potential opens to purchase the goodwill and assistance of others through the gifting of such things. This will initially occur only occasionally and in an unsystematic manner, but the tribe's social conditions will soon lead to a livelier and more regular exchange. Almost everywhere, the custom of purchasing brides emerges as female children are viewed as the property of their parents and are then only given away in exchange for other private property. Even more important is the emergence of taxes. In primitive conditions, the chief, who often recedes into the background in times of peace, generally can claim only minimal or no revenues. At most he might receive a special piece of the hunting bounty, and general provision is made for his sustenance, but one cannot speak of taxes in the proper sense. Such conditions can still be observed today, or have only been imperfectly eliminated. Chiefs in Liberia's hinterland can only levy taxes in the event of war, whereas in northeastern Africa voluntary donations are often gathered only when the chief needs money. Among Brazilian natives, chiefs receive neither tributes nor gifts but only a larger share of the war loot. The conflict between power and justice occasionally leads to the unfortunate customs of the ruler carrying out raiding expeditions within his own territory to replenish his coffers or keeping thieves in his entourage who steal on his behalf. In Tahiti, the king's servants would ruthlessly plunder the people if taxes, the amount of which was not predetermined and which could be better described as gifts, were insufficient, and the king could simply confiscate trade goods exchanged with Europeans. In stark contrast, in the kingdom of the Luba Lord Kalamba, tax collection was not much more than some form of organized begging. Almost everywhere, the goal of bringing a portion of the possessions amassed by private individuals into the hands of chiefs is achieved indirectly, usually in the form of monetary fines, which in this sense are the beginning or at least the trigger for actual taxation. As soon as considerable private ownership was established, it became possible to avoid physical punishment by surrendering assets, a path that met little resistance because of several factors. Firstly, a more precise gradation and weighing of penalties was now possible, which was inevitable anyhow for more civilized cultures. Secondarily, the damaged party could be offered an actual compensation instead of a mere quenching of his thirst for revenge. And lastly, the chief, called upon as judge, was able to appropriate a part of the fine as a fee for his efforts or, if there was no injured party, could pocket the fine without further ado. This is how, in many cases, the first income streams of the chief develop, which often also remain his only ones. It is quite natural that the entire judicial process therefore often seems to be geared towards extorting as much as possible from the disputing parties. At the same time the prestige of the adjudicating chief is promoted, the habit of keeping his good favor by regular gifting becomes common, and, mediated by this customary law, real taxation of the entire populace is gradually established. All generally and permanently appreciated possessions naturally present themselves as means of payment, which now in their new use truly deserve the label of money, where no external relations come into play. Money is still principally used for the payment of fines, as Semper, for example, explicitly confirms for the peculiar inside money of the Palau Islands, where every kind of payment is still simply referred to as a fine. Even among more advanced societies, monetary fines serve as a regular source of income. A large part of the revenue of the Vandal kings in North Africa flowed from the fines that the majority of their subjects, staunchly Catholic, had to pay to their Arius following rulers, and indeed this exploitation of the Catholics became a royal prerogative. Fines, taxes, and frequent gifts render certain private possessions transactable, transforming them into a social power that shapes the whole inner life of the tribe. Deeply entrenched customs and practices succumb to this new power, and rigid forms become more flexible under its effect. Not only can the criminal who violates laws and mores evade what would otherwise be inevitable annihilation. On some Polynesian islands, a frightened mother can use money to save the life of a superfluous child who, by ancient custom, was destined to die. Power relations within the tribe begin to shift. Apart from the chief, Other characters step up whose services have to be purchased through payments, notably the priest or sorcerer who heals diseases, summons the rain, or foretells the future. The father of a beautiful daughter now only parts with that valuable possession in return for a corresponding compensation, and the more ancient communism fades away, the more numerous become the services and things that can only be had for money. It is primarily money that destroys communism. Everyone is forced to raise money for unavoidable payments, and as not everyone will be able to produce their own money, which is made outright impossible anyhow with advancing developments, individuals must more and more withdraw their labor and its fruits from common ownership and demand monetary compensation for services they provide to others. This creates a circulation of inside money within the tribe, even though it cannot be used in outward transactions with other tribes. We encounter typical examples of inside money especially in Melanesia and Micronesia. The numerous varieties of Melanesian shell money belong to this category, as do the peculiar types of money on the Carolines, which do not serve external trade but are exclusively used on certain islands. Kubery reports on their social significance. The need to earn a living makes money indispensable to us, but the islanders have no need for money as all are self-sufficient. The arts and industry have not yet differentiated much among this people and are still possessed by the entire community, so luxury goods are unknown here. And yet, money plays a pivotal role in the life of the inhabitants. Conceived as an animal, man has enough here for sustenance, but if he wants to have a wife, found a family, be a member of a state, he must possess money. The existence of a community as a political state relies on the money owned by the heads of the families. The relations of exogamous marriage can only be maintained through a sustained exchange of goods or money. In reality, the seemingly carefree son of nature has far more worries than an industrious worker among us, who, once he has fulfilled his duties to the state, is his own master and only has to provide for his own family. In Melanesia, admission into secret societies, which enhances one's social status, must, moreover, be bought with money, and it is quite understandable that through such manifold coercive situations, which occasionally make obtaining money a necessity, a substantial dominance of the wealthy over the poor emerges, which, in places, is recklessly exploited. The poor must borrow and become dependent on their creditors. The idea that, just as for the rendering of any other service, compensation is to be paid for the lending of money suggests itself, and even among tribes whose internal monetary relations have developed relatively unaffected by external trade, specific interest payments must be paid by debtors. Practices of this kind are found on the Palau Islands, as well as in the Bismarck Archipelago, and on some of the Solomon Islands. The unfortunate practice is present that a wealthy man can force others to borrow money from him, thereby bringing them under his sway. In such cases, where the corrective effect of outside money is missing, interest rates are often absurdly high. On the island of Nias, debt doubles annually, and it happens that members of an entire family become slaves for the initial debt of a single piece of brass wire. As money became more important and social standing increasingly depended on possessing greater wealth, it made less and less sense that the production of money took place within the tribe. As long as everyone was able to produce money in any desired quantity, the powerful position of wealthy men and chiefs could easily be undermined and the social structure of society upset. This was somehow bearable if the circulating medium was difficult to produce, like the diwara of the Bismarck Archipelago, the bulk of which originated in ancient times and has only insignificantly increased. However, regarding many Melanesian shell monies we encounter a striking fact. In regions where the shells are found and manufactured into currency discs, this money is not used for transactions, but is instead exported as merchandise to neighboring areas and only put into circulation there. This phenomenon is well attested for on the Solomon Islands, in Igbo areas along the Niger River, where cowrie shells are not accepted as payment. People engage in threading perforated cowries onto strings which are then exported to Bonny, where they circulate as money. On the Caroline Islands, however, the prevailing currency is an ancient money of unknown origin that no one can replicate anymore. 3. Forms of inside money. The defining traits of inside money are its durability and the general appreciation it enjoys, which enable the accumulation of wealth. It does not need to be light in weight or generally useful. The first is unnecessary because the area where it circulates is limited, making its transport across long distances superfluous. The second is not necessary either, because its selection is frequently a matter of caprice and taste rather than practical reason. We can observe, therefore, grotesque excesses of inside money, such as the curious stone money of the Caroline Islands, which consists of hundredweight millstone, like pieces of aragonite that are brought over from the Palau Islands by way of daring oversea trips. Finch is probably correct in seeing them as colossal replicas of the small shell discs used as a circulating medium. Despite having no practical use and rarely changing hands, these gigantic stones, especially the larger ones, are an embodiment of wealth and power. Owning them confers a prestige that is unreservedly acknowledged by all. When ancient communities of ownership break down, all sorts of things that have real or imagined value can become money in a similar way, insofar as power and prestige can be amassed and stored with and through them. In former times, before European trade directly encroached upon them, many African chiefs collected enormous amounts of ivory, without using it for any other purpose. In Borneo, the Dayak regard antique Chinese porcelain pots, which are still sacred due to their relation to the cult of the dead, as the ultimate wealth. In certain areas of Indochina and the Malay archipelago, old bronze drums, possibly of Chinese origin, step into this role, as also do, in other parts of the archipelago, bronze cannons. All these partially or completely imaginary values, which we can, in a sense, already call inside money, are preceded by living monetary property, embodied in livestock and slaves. While the wealth invested in inside money can easily lose its value as soon as a livelier economic life brings new ideas to a place and, as we will see below, remodels the nature of money decisively, the value of livestock and slaves, being fundamentally real, remains unshaken by such influences. More than anything, living beings are a directly interest-yielding and self-reproducing form of capital. The cattle's milk and the slave's labor relieve the owner of the worries about his daily subsistence. And as long as there is sufficient grazing land and no outbreak of diseases, there are no limits to the multiplication of the livestock and thus the growth of wealth. Under certain conditions, the number of slaves can increase even more, as it does not necessarily have to be in proportion to the available arable land farmed by slaves. The use of large numbers of slaves in manufacturing and trade is quite common in less civilized countries. A chief from Nyang, along the Upper Congo, opined to Cameron, in a naive but appropriate way, that it would be more prudent to deposit his trading profits in slaves than in ornament money. He explained that if he were to bring cowrie shells home, his wives would take them to adorn themselves, leaving him empty-handed. Slaves, on the other hand, could be put to use immediately and would not lie idle, while the cowries would not yield any returns until he exchanged them for slaves. In the earliest periods of classical antiquity, we also find cattle and sheep serving as measures of value and wealth, as an inside money in the proper sense, and they certainly also held some significance as a means of exchange, because they were widely appreciated. However, as should be clear from what has been laid out so far, it would be unjustified, based solely on this isolated fact, to place cattle money at the beginning of the entire process. The cattle wealth of certain African tribes, like the Herero or the Dinka, developed even more starkly as inside money, as they appear to be entirely inaccessible to trade. Even recently, Emin Pasha felt obliged to resort to raids to secure necessary food supplies for his troops, as the natives were unwilling to part with their cattle at any price. In contrast, the few available cattle among the crew, which form an indispensable part of bride payments, constantly change owners and locations, while inside money, due to its quality as a valuable property, often appears in a static and unwieldy form. It is, as a measure of value, intimately related to the beginnings of measures and weights. It frequently catalyzes the creation of actual systems of measure and weight and likely contributes to the linguistic expansion of the numerical sequence. In present-day China, precious metals are almost always weighed, comparable to how gold circulated in unminted form in ancient Rome long after the introduction of silver currency. On the other hand, the coins of civilized nations also supply certain tribes with a weight unit, such as in the well-known case of the Maria Theresa thaler, which functions as the standard weight in Abyssinia. A national coin that simultaneously represents a weight unit is the Thai and Burmese tikal, and the same holds for the shekel of the ancient Hebrews. Shell money threaded on strings, on the other hand, necessitates the creation of a unit of length, a measure that some native Californians even tattoo onto their arm for permanent use. More often, the arm itself is chosen as the scale, and it is very likely that the Californian measurement developed out of this imperfect one. The method of measuring cloth used as money by the length of the forearm is still found, among other places, all over German East Africa. Even surface area units, whose origins overlap with the emerging division of land, are required where mats, furs, and blankets of specific sizes serve as measures of value. Yet greater ingenuity becomes necessary when different measures of value coexist, and the complexities associated with multiple currencies begin to manifest themselves. Indeed, the persistent fluctuations in the value ratio of the two primary types of livestock money, cattle and sheep, caused their replacement with metal currency in both Greece and Rome, initially a simple copper currency in Rome. However, because the most problematic fluctuations only occur once the money supply increases unevenly or decreases through external trade, we will postpone the discussion of these conditions for now. If we look at how the development of inside money takes shape under more or less normal conditions, a few simple principles reveal themselves. As the individual's independence grows in relation to the collective, so do claims to personal property, which he does not acquire through mere appropriation or through labor in the ordinary sense, but by transforming things according to his moods and tastes, that is, according to his deepest being, thereby associating these things with his personality. As a uniform appreciation for certain objects gradually establishes itself, these are eventually recognized as valuable property and universal measures of value. This recognition makes the individual's property more mobile. He can now use it more effectively to prevent imminent threats, to pay for a death sentence to be commuted, and to secure the goodwill and support of the powerful. As soon as certain people, particularly chiefs and priests, begin to pull valuable property towards themselves, social disparities develop and intensify, while the possibility of breaking through social barriers by means of the new instrument of power also arises simultaneously. The more the ancient common property dissolves into private property, and the further the division of labor advances, the greater and more varied becomes the number of possible types of money, including those that no longer possess money's fundamental original peculiarities. Certain types of money serve more as valuable property, while others more as instruments of power or primarily as measures of value, thereby giving rise to all sorts of distinctions. Indeed, differently developed forms can exist side by side. Inside money, in its typical form, is therefore not yet a means of exchange analogous to that of contemporary civilizations, since the ability to circulate easily, thus its usability for trade, is not among its essential features. However, in essence and in practice, inside money already closely resembles our money, or, to put it more precisely, it constitutes the primary root of our culture's monetary system. 4. Sign money. Inside money can perform its essential social functions even when it is too bulky, too precious, or too fragile to change hands frequently, but this immovability can, when taken to the extreme, prove to be cumbersome. In any case, the hoarding drive invariably brings huge amounts of money to a standstill and withdraws it from economic life, and this tendency, peculiar to and quite consistent with the nature of inside money as an instrument of social power, often persists in the case of coined metal, resulting in an undesirable and nearly unresolvable chronic shortage of circulating coins. In South Asia, a significant percentage of circulating silver money disappears annually, often because amounts of money that had been buried can no longer be located after the owner's death and are rediscovered only sporadically by chance. In Persia, a chronic shortage of small change is partially caused by similar reasons and partially because the Shah aims to accumulate as much metal currency in his treasury as possible. Similarly, all cash ended up in the state treasury or was buried by its owners in Korea. Even cowrie shells in Africa, despite their low value, have been buried and thereby withdrawn from circulation. Agreed upon valuables might become unsuitable for the smaller social tasks of everyday life. This shortcoming can be remedied in several ways, primarily by the emergence of smaller, less valuable types of money alongside the larger, more precious ones, which are then used for minor purposes, while the more unwieldy money is only mobilized on particularly significant occasions. The situation on the Caroline Islands offers a fascinating illustration of such a process. Grounded in the principles of inside money, which has been detailed extensively in Kubery's already mentioned work, the most valuable money on the island of Yap is the GAU, a type of shell money, which only changes its owner in the case of war and is kept as the highest treasure by the chiefs not because of its weight but because of its age, and because it was introduced in limited quantities from distant islands via a trade route that has long since vanished. It is followed in value by the already mentioned stone money, originating from Palau, and available in pieces of varying sizes. A captain called O'Keefe, who brought numerous, unusually large blocks of aragonite to Yap on his ship, amassed a fortune in this manner, while the value of the smaller stone money of course declined significantly. The third type of money there and the actual small change are mother of pearl shells, which are strung on threads and considered the money of women. Larger pieces of mother of pearl shells imported from outside are deemed more valuable than the local ones and only chiefs are permitted to own them. An interesting example of how the nature of inside money always accentuates social differences. All minor payments are settled with mother of pearl money, and it can be added to stone money in the manner of small change. For instance, a pig costs a small piece of stone money and 20 mother of pearl shells. The emergence of smaller types of money, suitable for circulation, is significantly driven and favored by external trade, as will be seen below. However, even within the tribe, there was the possibility of bringing about a more rapid turnover of otherwise stagnant wealth, at least to some degree, through the introduction of sign money. Sign money, seemingly epitomized in its most ideal form by our banknotes, is commonly considered an achievement of the most civilized societies. Yet, if we interpret the concept of sign money not too narrowly, this is totally incorrect. At its core, even inside money in its simple ornamental form, is not much more than a recognized symbol of value that fulfills its purpose within a specific community but remains ineffective outside of it. Let us imagine that a tribe using shell money is conquered and wiped out by another tribe that values cloths and pearls as measures of value. The shell money treasures, so highly esteemed by its former owners, would likely not be noticed by the conquerors, much less be appreciated in the same way. A European would probably throw the precious money of the Palau Islands, which consists of pieces of old glass and pearls, onto a rubbish heap if it were handed over to him without further explanation. The Palau Islander of past times, who stood outside our cultural sphere, might have treated European coins in a similar manner or possibly kept them as curiosities. Insofar as the value of all inside money is based upon arbitrary appreciations which are only accepted because they became solid and fixed over time, it is not at all inconceivable that even purely imagined values could fulfill the role of inside money within specific communities. To understand the nature and efficacy of sign money, one must recall the gambling ships of Europe's civilized nations. A group of individuals, who trust each other's integrity and solvency, agree to forego cumbersome payments during a game and instead use tokens which are redeemed at the end of the game. In a society where a passion for gambling is particularly intense, tokens of this kind can even take the place of real coins. In Indochina, porcelain, lacquer, and clay tokens issued by Chinese gambling dens often serve as small change in local transactions, providing makeshift substitutes for scarce coins. Other kinds of sign money have also been successful, such as the coin-like coupons issued by numerous South American horse-drawn bus companies, that resemble gutta percha, or our postage stamps, which were issued for a distinct purpose, but have come to serve as a popular means of payment. It is possible that certain prehistoric shards, which were discovered here and there in larger quantities and have often been considered money due to their uniform size, might have actually been gambling ships that were temporarily used as coins. It is obvious that the subjective value of sign money depends on trust alone. If an entire tribe agrees to regard this or that object as a means of payment and if everyone is willing to accept it at its fixed value, it will circulate as a true and proper money. The term agree is chosen merely for the sake of brevity, as the process is typically less simple, although the result remains the same. If a chief or lord wields the necessary influence, he can arbitrarily create new means of payment to alleviate a shortage of small change. The history of Russia provides a very fine example. Instead of the impractical fur money circulating throughout the empire, Tsars of the earlier ages issued small, stamped pieces of the scalp of those animals whose furs were then stockpiled at the Tsar's court and used for international trade alone. The attempt was extremely successful because confidence in the ruler was boundless. The objects of value represented by this sign fur money were in fact available, and trading with foreign countries, which would obviously not have scraps of leather foisted upon them, had little impact on the daily life of the people. When an enormous mass of furs had accumulated in the Siberian Chancellery in Moscow, the opening of trade with China in 1698 provided relief, and as furs flooded into China, so many Chinese products and commodities flowed back into Russia in return that Empress Anna, in the absence of cash, paid the salaries of her officials and officers with these commodities. Perhaps inspired by this precedent, the Russian government later endeavored to withdraw all silver money and replace it with copper sign money twice, but both times this resulted in a catastrophic destabilization of Russian credit and commerce. Russia was no longer an isolated state that could rely on a pure inside money of a symbolic kind. It was a part of Europe and influenced by Western European ideas about money. Sweden's attempt to alleviate its depleted finances by issuing sign money failed in a similar way. In England, it appears that leather sign money survived well into the Middle Ages, and in Sicily, the Norman King William I attempted to withdraw all cash from circulation and replace it with leather coins in 1161, apparently not without success. The Russian leather money is also noteworthy because it might offer advice on how to interpret older, enigmatic cases of leather sign money, such as those of the Britons, Scandinavians, and others. If these types of leather sign money did not also represent convenient substitutes for animal furs, they may have symbolized living livestock. Somewhat related is the practice of a Chinese emperor who, in return for gifts from his vassals, distributed small pieces of white deer hide instead of real money. He kept a large number of these animals in his zoological garden. The mysterious Carthaginian sign money, made up of an unidentified fabric sewn into leather, on the other hand, might have had a different meaning and could have initially belonged to the types of sacred money to which we will return later. As a very interesting transitional link, the cacao money of the ancient Mexicans makes the change from real to intrinsically valueless money palpable. Among the varieties of cacao, one had especially large kernels that produced the least appreciated cacao, which was only occasionally consumed. But interestingly, it was precisely this variety that circulated as money while varieties of higher quality were considered commodities. A part of the value attributed to cacao money was, therefore, already imaginary. The simplest and most recognizable forms of sign money generally arise from those types of money that have a practical purpose. Once the circulating monetary medium no longer meets its original purpose, it becomes a mere symbol of the actual fundamental value and thereby turns into sign money. Fabric seem most likely to undergo this transformation. The strips of cotton cloth circulating as money in the central Sahel are often so narrow that they cannot be reused in any useful way. In ancient Bohemia, pieces of cloth, impractical due to their loose weave, circulated as money, and the small mats, which were in circulation in the Lower Congo, and, bearing the government's stamp, even served as a general means of payment during the Portuguese era, have been rightly labeled a form of paper money by Clem. The same is true for the mat money in the northern New Hebrides, about which Codrington reports. The mats are long and narrow, made for no other purpose than to represent value, and are in Aurora and Lepers Island valued the more ancient and black they are. The mats are kept in little houses specially built for them, in which a fire is kept always burning to blacken them. Though these mats will buy anything of sufficient value to equal a mat, they are mostly used for buying the steps in the souk club. A rich man will keep 50 mats and more in his house, hung up and decaying, a proof of ancient wealth. Coote, who also describes the mat money, has pictures of the above-mentioned smoked houses, and notes that a high-quality mat of this kind corresponds to the value of a full-grown boar along with its highly appreciated tusks. Here we may have the most typical example of a primitive sign money, which neither embodies a practical nor, as it is the case with adornments, a subjective value. Yet, it still performs all the tasks of a proper money, being a measure of value, a medium of exchange, and an embodiment of wealth. In curious ways, a kind of sign money can even implant itself in relatively civilized circumstances, which emphasizes the already semi-blurred distinction between inside and outside money again more sharply. The full-value gold and silver coins from the South American republics, particularly from Peru, had been flowing out for a long time as a result of these republics' negative trade balance, and, in their place, inferior Bolivian silver coins unfit for foreign trade spread widely until they had almost become a mere inside money. This phenomenon is even more pronounced with the paper money of states that are partially or fully bankrupt. Such money always continues to circulate longest in the country's small retail transactions, which unavoidably require small change. This was observed, among other instances, after the large financial crash in Peru where, in the absence of a better alternative, utterly devalued paper money continued to circulate in petty market trades. In difficult times, small-scale commerce even comes up with its own symbols of value that circulate within a limited area and adequately fulfill their intended function, as has recently been the case in Jerusalem where the bong of Jewish butchers and bakers as well as the brass tokens from a guesthouse owner circulated as money. These types of sign money rarely cause significant disruptions in a society's internal economic life. These tend to occur when a lord or chief introduces a sign money clearly intending to replace circulating assets with his newly created money. The result is, of course, that all assets flow into the hands of the ruler, and if this process is further exacerbated by the ruler making all his payments in sign money, while demanding taxes to be paid in real types of money, then the most profound destabilization in the daily life of people is inevitable. As soon as real money is removed from economic life, international trade becomes extremely difficult and only possible in the form of barter. Some remedy is introduced when the ruler claims a monopoly on foreign trade, thereby also drawing all the profits to himself. This approach consolidates the entire economic power of the people in the ruler's hands. Certainly a very desirable situation for the ruler, but only bearable for the people if they can meet their economic needs independently. Isolation from the outside world is both a precondition and an effect of primitive sign money, which, by possessing this trait, proves that it is an extreme form of inside money. On a grand scale, Kublai Khan, the ruler of the Mongolian Empire, drove out metal money with sign money, specifically stamped pieces of paper, evidently following the Chinese example. Marco Polo's accounts indicate that the endeavor must have temporarily succeeded only because of the tremendous power and authority of the ruler, with the result of a vast accumulation of gold and silver in the Khan's residence. Given the colossal size of the Mongolian Empire, nearly all trade was internal trade and remained undisturbed by paper money as long as its value was maintained by trust in the ruler's power. However, it appears that in the border areas engaging in foreign trade, this sign money did not gain a foothold and was eventually completely withdrawn. 5. Sacred money. The argument thus far has sufficiently demonstrated that those objects which first differentiate themselves from others as property and subsequently as money do not possess a real and universally accepted inherent value, and that this value, if it is present, is a mere secondary aspect alongside a purely subjective valuation. The first and main cause of this subjective valuation, namely the transfer of someone's own essence into an object through artistic transformation in the broadest sense, has already been described. However, as the concept of money continues to develop, numerous other supplementary sources of value appreciation occur. Leaving aside humanity's always active mimetic drive or herd instinct, an object can be valued higher than others and eventually acquire the characteristics of a typical inside money simply because it is rare and difficult, perhaps even dangerous, to obtain. For instance, the teeth of the sperm whale, which was rarely hunted successfully, served as a measure of value and a peace symbol in Fiji that chiefs used to send to each other. They also circulate as money on the Gilbert Islands. Similarly, almost circularly curved boar tusks are highly valued and used as a means of payment in German New Guinea. The red feathered scalp of a woodpecker circulates among the Karuk, a Native American tribe in California, and animal skulls, preserved as hunting trophies, are used among the Mismi in Assam as both valuable property and money, facilitating trade with neighboring tribes. Occasionally, the entire money supply originates from an earlier time, as is the case with the currency of the Palau Islands, or the age of individual pieces enhances their value, as we saw with the mat money of the New Hebrides. While this shrouds the origin of money in mysterious darkness, it allows the imagination to play around with mythological fabrications, which in turn contribute to the extraordinary increase in the value of the circulating monetary instruments. The old shard money of the Palau Islands, for instance, is believed to be of celestial origin, produced by mythical birds and fish or found on the shores of mysterious islands. When exchanging particularly valued pieces, a premium must be paid to appease the money's feelings, which is believed to possess a spirit. Similarly, a mythical origin is attributed to the abalone shells of Northwest America, yet, this is only one, comparatively infrequent, path by which money attains mystical attributes. Another one leads directly back to money's simplest original form, ornamentation. Many objects worn as jewelry serve also as protective amulets, warding off all sorts of malevolent influences, especially the teeth, claws, and beaks of animals, strangely shaped roots and stones, mirrors, and the like. Other ornaments are supposed to have a calming effect on the ghostly beings that threaten humans because of their beautiful appearance or are believed to encapsulate a protective spirit within them. Such ideas are often expressed in the decorative style of various objects. Shells, which stand out among primitive jewelry and money, are also used as amulets, especially in South Asia. This valuation might stem from the resemblance of certain shells and snails to horns, as the latter are popular objects used to defend oneself against malevolent influences. Even the best-known money shell, Cypria moneta, appears to be used as a talisman. As a note by Isert suggests, Lander observed a sorcerer in the Yoruba region who had draped himself with an immense mass of cowries, an estimated 20,000 pieces, probably not merely for personal adornment but driven by mystical motives. It is understandable that while such ornaments, to which different mystical beliefs are attached, do not lose their special meaning even when they find a more general use as a means of payment, certain coins, like the well-known Jorgstala, can, conversely, transform into talismans. In Mecca, the center of Islam, old Venetian gold coins featuring depictions of Christ and Mark the Evangelist serve as the most popular amulets for women, and in Tibet, Indian rupees quickly became vernacular partly because the image of Queen Victoria was taken for that of the Dalai Lama, which conferred a special mystical value upon the coins. Thereby, a new impetus for the accumulation of money emerged. However, we have to consider yet another cause for the emergence of sacred types of money, namely the direct or indirect relation of money to the dead or to the cult of the dead. The extent to which concerns about conditions in the afterlife stimulate the acquisition of wealth must be briefly mentioned. On the Lower Congo, large quantities of mat money were formerly collected to enshroud the bodies of the deceased, turning the corpses of noblemen into shapeless bundles. In the hinterland of Angola, European cotton fabrics are still acquired and hoarded for the same purpose. Money that is placed into the graves of the deceased is lost for the living, as nobody wants to possess it, and even if it is accidentally unearthed, it is deemed to be of no value. Even the money inherited by relatives is often treated with a certain wariness, because the claims of the dead, who are commonly imagined to be envious and vengeful, are not to be easily dismissed. The New Britain custom of distributing shell money at festivals of the dead in honor of a relative is possibly based on this sentiment, at least, as will be shown below chapter 6. There is no shortage of similar customs suggesting that donating the deceased's property is preferable to keeping it for oneself. Given that all money that circulates for long has at some point in time been in the possession of those now deceased, notions of the uncanny and the magical easily attach themselves to it. Generally, inherited and precious items from earlier times easily acquire a certain sacredness and value far beyond the ordinary. One example is the imperial regalia of the German emperors, without which no coronation was deemed truly valid and whose possession was therefore most actively strived for by contenders to the throne. Such valuables, which embody the dignity of the ruler, are also not unknown among indigenous peoples. But the cult of the dead itself can even directly create new objects of value. The old Chinese porcelain vases, the possession of which is the ultimate aim of any Dayak, most likely owe their tremendous esteem to the fact that they were used to store the remains of the deceased and are now attributed with supernatural powers. We are thus dealing with a kind of relic worship, also familiar to European civilizations. The remains of the dead themselves can also become valuable property and even a means of payment through this process. Whether Hernsheim's isolated statement that the remains of dead noblemen wrapped in mats circulate as money on Yap holds any truth may be left aside. In any case, the skull cult, which directly evolves from ancestor veneration, can easily lead to the appreciation of amassed skulls as valuable property that can also be transacted under certain circumstances. The possession of heads, says Lingroth about the Northern Dayak, gives them great consideration as warriors and men of wealth, the skulls being prized as the most valuable of goods. According to an older report, human skulls did indeed serve as money among the Batak. The fact that some of the notorious captains who long terrorized the South Seas massacred harmless natives to use their heads for the purchase of sandalwood may be mentioned as demonstrating a genuine business spirit. It is not always possible to discern the causes behind the mystical value attributed to some types of money, but its frequent presence seems undeniable. Old glass beads that are preserved in parts of West Africa as testimonies of a former trade are associated with numerous legends and superstitious beliefs. The peculiar copper plates that are valued to the utmost on the northwest coast of America and passed down through generations have a specific cult dedicated to them. Each individual shield has its own name and house and receives regular meals. No woman is allowed to enter the house. Almost every tribe has a legend about their copper plates' origin. Some say someone received them when he visited the man on the moon, others that they come from a chief residing in the ocean, and so on. This cult is much less developed among the northern tribes. Many Melanesian types of money are ambiguously intertwined with the concept of tabu or tambu, a concept that likely originates from the cult of the dead. Shell money is stored in tambu houses. The large Diwara rings of the New Britons are called tambu aloli, and in New Guinea, we find that the word tortor is used for money. Sperm whale teeth are also called tabua in Fiji, and a spirit of the whale tooth is mentioned. The Northwest American practice of using the corpses of slain slaves as bait when fishing for the dentalium mollusks used as money likewise suggests some mystical idea. The above-mentioned copper plates also served as a kind of bell, and it is plausible that the mysterious sound they emit when struck significantly contributed to their perceived sacredness. For the same reason, Chinese bronze drums may still serve or have served as valuables and money in the Philippines, and elsewhere in Indonesia and Indochina. Among advanced peoples, money attains a degree of sacredness in a completely different way. Just as money was given to the spirits of the deceased, valuable things, precious metals, and eventually coined money were also sacrificed to the gods. It may be mentioned in passing that at times gods are deemed more conservative than humans. In Italy, for instance, the raw copper pieces that previously circulated as a means of payment were still presented as offerings long after the introduction of minted coins. Enormous treasures thereby gradually accumulated in temples. Some, like those at Delphi, eventually succumbed to the inevitable fate of being plundered or carted away by unscrupulous rulers or enemies of the state. Even though a portion of these treasures, in the form of precious equipment, remained as immovable property within the temple premises, the priesthood was nonetheless eager to lend their surplus to reliable individuals at an appropriate rate of interest, while fairs and markets held in the vicinity of these sacred sites further facilitated the circulation of the accumulated assets. The gods were the first capitalists in Greece. Their temples were the earliest banks, concludes Curtius, who has devoted an intelligent treatise to these issues. Notably, the priests of Aphrodite Urania, whose temples stood in all trading ports, introduced monetary transactions and credit, and they were also the first to stamp metal pieces with the image of their goddess, thus giving rise to the beginnings of coinage. Priests of other deities also distributed minted coins early on as medals and mementos during competitions, and when the state finally regulated the monetary system, it was natural that the temples continued to serve as mints, and that an aura of the sacred remained intrinsic to all processes associated with minting. According to Curtius, all Hellenic money was sacred, and the place of mintage holy ground, and, therefore, even during the time of Alexander the Great, no sovereigns were depicted on coins, only the images and symbols of the gods. What is true of Greece can justifiably be asserted for parts of the Orient as well, particularly for Phoenicia, which preceded Greece in matters of commerce and frequently served as its role model. It can be assumed that the money changers, whom Christ, as a defender of a higher worldview, drove out of the temple in Jerusalem, had a certain historical right to be there. Money, trade, and religion had a good relationship with one another in antiquity, and a glimmer of sacredness even radiated from the dirty small coins that wandered from hand to hand in retail transactions or gathered on the money changer's table. 6. Accumulation of property by individuals countermeasures even in places without actual inside money. All things considered, self reproducing or durable types of valuable property can obviously be acquired and accumulated by individuals in disproportionate quantities. This accumulation of property is precisely one of those seeds from which real money evolves. In Polynesia, where an inside money circulating as a means of payment is almost non-existent, there are still disparities in wealth, which manifest not only in the unequal distribution of land but also in the fact that the wealthy begin to invest their excess income or the surplus created by the labor force they command in specific things, particularly in enormous amounts of bark cloth, tappa, or in mats which are even inherited from generation to generation and valued according to their age in Samoa. This last aspect already shows the emergence of that imaginary valuation so characteristic of proper inside money. True forms of money have a value that does not lie in their practical use, but is created and sanctified by provenance. They are, in a sense, the aristocracy of possessions. Compared to useful goods, these items confer a different kind of influence to those who own them in great quantities. They guarantee not just the possibility of a comfortable life, but real power and, in some circumstances, something akin to sacredness. These instruments of power do not always accumulate in the hands of the leaders of the people, the chiefs and lords, or at least, for reasons to be discussed shortly, they do not remain with them permanently. This opens a path for others to gain dominance through the ownership of money, particularly for the priesthood in whose temples immense treasures often accumulate without re-entering the transactions of daily life. This is not limited to civilized nations. The inhabitants of the small Polynesian island of Funafuti, for instance, bring their wealth, beautiful mats and mother-of-pearl fishing hooks, en masse as offerings to the temple, and all foreign valuables that somehow reach the island follow the same route. Similarly, other members of the tribal community are also able to gain various forms of influence and undermine the previous social order by accumulating money. Inside money, in a narrower sense, differentiates itself from other real assets primarily because, at least in the realm of imagination, there is no barrier to its multiplication, allowing the hoarding drive to unfold its full force. Someone gripped by it no longer works to merely sustain his life and to make it comfortable, but to acquire. In just this one word, the immense significance of this process for the development of humanity is expressed. The fact that the acquisitive sense does not remain confined to individuals but is inevitably transmitted to the entire social organism is ensured by the social transformation brought about by wealth. Everyone is now compelled to join the competition for property or he will be pulled into the vortex created by one of the newly emerging centers of power and property, where he will need to work hard to be able to live at all. For the property owner, no temporal limit constrains his view on the perpetual increase of his wealth. The civilized man hopes that his accumulated riches will ease his children's existence and allow him to live on and enjoy life through them. The primitive man, in contrast, believes that he will have access to all the goods given to him in the grave, even in the afterlife. Thus, he too knows no bounds to acquisition. It hardly needs saying that this new phase of social existence does not meet general approval. If the primordial purpose of the community and its members was to keep themselves in balance with surrounding nature, and if any labor that went beyond the absolutely necessary was voluntary, now the prospect of an endless, essentially enforced, activity and toil emerged, which was rooted in and incentivized by the inequality of anticipated rewards and completely shattered the old communism and irretrievably annihilated natural life's heavenly comforts. Naturally, this threatening process was not clearly recognized, it was only intuited, and, in full accordance with one of the most important anthropological laws, people consciously made use of customs that originally served another purpose to counteract the menace. They thereby managed to control the excessive accumulation of wealth in many different ways, and it is quite instructive to take a look at these methods. In a way, wealth itself inherently tends toward self-destruction, as it often leads to the degeneration of its owners. Many of those who seem to have acquired, alongside their wealth, the prospect of infinite pleasure, perish miserably in their ill-fated attempt to savor all the pleasures now within reach. This applies even more to the descendants of those driven by the desire for acquisition. The degeneration and stupefaction of noble lineages or wealthy merchant families, which is one of the most common phenomena in Europe, is found in exactly the same way in China, where the great fortunes of merchants often vanish into thin air within a brief period due to the carelessness and hedonism of their children or grandchildren. the propensity for gambling, which is not unique to many members of civilized societies but also highly developed among, for example, the natives of North America and in numerous other primitive societies, contributes to the disintegration of wealth. However, several other factors also counteract the accumulation and, especially, the inheritance of money. For once, remnants of the ancient communism remain alive enough for a long time to effectively block attempts to amass as many assets as possible in a single hand, and in places without an actual system of debt and interest, the powerful individual, into whose house the tributes of the people flow, has indeed little choice but to represent by way of his wealth. In other words, to allow the people to participate in his indulgences. His gain lies entirely on a moral level, for although the hoarded treasures provide him with a certain moral superiority, they only become fruitful when he generously distributes them to his friends and followers, winning their hearts and thereby establishing real power based on loyal devotion. This view was quite common among the old Germanic tribes. The ideal figure for those troops that turned Rome to dust was not the chief or king who brooded over his treasures like a dragon, but the generous army leader who held an open table, gave away treasures to his followers eagerly, and tied the fearless and stalwart fellows to himself with abundant gifts. Even in the Middle Ages, the most glorified quality of the lords, besides bravery in war, was mild, an inexhaustible generosity, and poets like Wilder von der Vogel would never get tired of demanding and lauding it. Speaking with high praise of the Landgrave Hermann of Thuringia, he says, "In the Landgrave's service, loyally I stand. I am always to be found beside the finest lord in the land. Though other lords display their generosity none as steadfastly, he was so and still is, and the generosity of Leopold of Austria elates him. One saw the young prince give, as if he no longer wished to live. Many marvels were performed with goodness then." The Native American tribes of the Missouri Valley held exactly the same views. Generosity earned respect and power, and the grand gift-giving feasts, just as glorious deeds in war, were painted on the cloaks worn during ceremonial occasions. The rulers of Tahiti also almost spent more than they earned. All profit was quickly distributed among their followers. If mutual jealousy and rivalry come into play as well, the most fantastic squandering of possessions develops. Even the destitute Aboriginal Australians of Queensland like to distribute gifts to their peers to make a name for themselves. Generosity is practically an imperative when property consists of consumable substances prone to spoilage, but it wanes when durable types of money embody wealth. The Tongan chief Finau had well understood this danger when he spoke disparagingly about coined money in a conversation with Mariner. It would lead to the piling up of wealth instead of sharing it out, as a chief ought to do. This is reminiscent of a scene in Goethe's satire Gods, Heroes, and Wieland. Hercules, we had the bravest fellows among us. Wieland, what do you call a brave fellow? Hercules, one who shares what he has, and the richest is the bravest. Sharing can even become a duty. Such views are still, for instance, dominant among the civilized Kalalit of West Greenland. Even if he had a faculty for laying up riches, says Nansen, which he very seldom has, his needier fellows would have the right to enforce a claim upon such of his possessions as were not necessary for himself. Thus we find in Greenland this unfortunate state of things, that the European immigrants, who are in reality supported by the natives, often become rich and live in abundance, at any rate, according to the Eskimo ideas, while the natives themselves are in want. The Greenlander has not even unrestricted rights over the game he himself secures. There have been fixed rules from time immemorial according to which it is divided, and there are only a few sorts of animals which he can keep pretty well to himself and to his family. The communist countermeasures against wealth generally do not endure, and their effect is uncertain. Certain kinds of property seem to favor greed directly, especially cattle farming, which can literally turn into a hoarding addiction. Bulow, for instance, claims that the remarkable greed of the Herero can be explained by their excessive appreciation and multiplication of livestock. Nevertheless, there are additional barriers that counteract the unlimited accumulation of movable property. A whole set of ideas and customs stemming from the cult of the dead leads to the constant destruction or rendering useless of valuable property. and thereby prevents hoarded wealth from being inherited and growing into a dangerous instrument of power. This later purpose is achieved somewhat accidentally and has nothing to do with the original rationale that ultimately relies on the belief that the deceased does not give up his rights of ownership but jealously guards over his property to ensure that no heir makes use of it. To avoid the wrath of the dead who roam around as ghosts, one places their belongings in the grave or on the funeral pyre, or leaves a hut with all its contents untouched to decay. Essentially, the intention is to put the accumulated property at the disposal of the dead, but as the property is actually eliminated, its threatening social impact is abolished as well. At times, the sole purpose of a person's profit-making and accumulating activity is to gather sufficient means for the journey into the afterlife and for life in the land of souls, and no one would consider withholding even the smallest thing from him after his death. As an example, it may be mentioned that King Powhatan in Virginia had filled a treasure house with furs, copper, glass beads, and so on, but all these treasures were intended to be used solely for his burial. In some parts of West Africa, the wealthy hoard enormous amounts of fabrics. After death, the corpse is wrapped in these until a shapeless bale emerges for which a special house must be built. In the Yoruba region, after the death of a chief, one of his wives destroyed all of his valuable property and shell money and then committed suicide. Along the Niger, in Ida, during Landa's visit, a great sacrilege took place when the new chief unearthed the shell money treasures buried with his father, reportedly enough to fill 7 to 8 houses, and used them for himself. The indignation about the son's abnormal act was widespread. The actions of the chief of Ida may not have been guided by any deeper motives. Nevertheless, it is clear that although the destruction of hoarded money and valuable property may mitigate a social danger, it also, on one hand, often reduces national wealth in an undesired way and, on the other, diminishes the amount of circulating money to an inadequate level. Civilized states have therefore felt compelled to legally control this practice. A decree by Emperor Theodoric forbade his subjects to give money into the graves of the dead, and a Japanese law from the year 646 ordered that gold, silver, copper, and iron shall not be placed in the grave. Pearls and gems shall not be put into the mouth. Shirts made of pearl and armor made of precious stones shall not be put on the corpses. All this is done by foolish people. The destruction of property is not limited to gifts to the dead, whose last remnants are the well-known coins for the dead which are generally meant to pay the fare for the departed's passage. Equally extraordinary are the destruction and squandering of valuable property, particularly livestock and food, during those grand festivals of the dead that evolved out of sacrifices and are, among some peoples, not only an effective obstacle to the accumulation of wealth but have turned into economic calamities. Even the parsimonious Hereros slaughter large amounts of livestock without hesitation at the death of a chief, and among the Balanta all the deceased person's livestock is immediately killed and consumed. These festivals of the dead are most developed in the Malay archipelago, where a family is completely ruined in the case of frequent deaths, or where, as on the Kai Islands, a funeral is often postponed for a long time because the necessary and extraordinary means have not yet been raised. At times, the destruction of property is circumvented in a peculiar way, yet always without letting it fall into one hand alone, thereby effectively preventing the potentially dangerous accumulation of fluids and diverting them to individual nodes without causing harm to the social organism. This is achieved by having all members of the tribe, and not only the descendants, act as heirs, apparently under the assumption that the large number of participants confuses the dead person's vengeful feelings or intimidates him. Ancient communist ideas are, of course, also effective here. A transition to this idea is illustrated by the custom of the Bubi people on Fernando Po who give the deceased his jewelry but distribute his shell money and other belongings. The property of a deceased Inuit is a common good. The motor near Port Moresby ceremonially adorn the dead with all his jewelry, but take these valuables away from him at the last moment and distribute them among those present. Generally, the distribution of large gifts at festivals of the dead is a custom in many and diverse regions. In New Zealand, however, it has degenerated into a kind of legal plunder, which gave rise to very strange effects in the past. All these different countermeasures against wealth are often, as already mentioned, only semi-consciously applied, but at least in one location where inside money is prevalent, namely on the Caroline Islands. Several such measures are united and adhered to in a conscious way, because the little money that exists must constantly remain in circulation. Here, the chiefs in whose hands money naturally accumulates are not only fined in the same way as everyone else at every suitable opportunity, but they must also disburse particularly large amounts which returns the money to the public. Within the community, the circulation of money is already sufficiently ensured through the numerous dues and penalties to be paid in cases of insults, purchases, diseases, and deaths. But, additionally, it is stipulated that no one is allowed to use the objects of practical use that he himself produces. Instead, he must sell them and replace them with purchased ones. All prices are firmly determined by convention. In this way, inside money achieves the purpose of maintaining social equilibrium within the community quite well, in stark contrast to outside money, whose unimpeded operation often leads to uneven wealth accumulation among individuals. At the same time, this example shows in what sense the typical inside money is only a precursor to European currency money, without resembling it completely. While the restrictions on wealth noted so far have developed from the actions of the owners or their heirs, the material obstacles that arise from the nature of primitive money itself must also be mentioned. First of all, the amount of available money is often not significant and its value not too great. It is thus not even possible to hoard it in dangerously large quantities. Furthermore, many types of primitive money do not last indefinitely. They are treasures moth and rust destroy, such as the old mats in Melanesia and Samoa, all kinds of fabric money, and base metals. Lastly, they are often too bulky and unwieldy, and of too little intrinsic value to be accumulated en masse. To make excess wealth impossible, Sparta famously retained its inconvenient iron money, even when the other Greek states had long since moved to silver currency. Particularly the nomad, who constantly changes his whereabouts, cannot possibly carry heavy masses of money with him. His wealth are the herds grazing around his tent. This certainly does not improve his position. Livestock diseases threaten his property, and the envy of warlike neighbors keep him in a state of constant unrest. After all, the robber is often the ultimate remedy against wealth, and it is not only Schiller's Karl Moore who believes he is fulfilling a higher mission. His robber philosophy is quite familiar to many bandits in Italy or Spain. 7. The influence of external trade. Primitive forms of exchange outside money. As already mentioned, inside money is the primary root of the monetary system in general, and if it develops normally, it can fulfill the greater part of those tasks the money of today's civilized nations is meant for. Yet, especially in its typical forms, which are always appropriate for the mentality of a specific tribe or society, it loses its value and purchasing power if it has to take over the tasks of external trade as well. Expansion of a people's horizon and of their commerce therefore must have a transformative impact on the conditions of their monetary system in manifold ways. Perhaps none of the forms of inside money that we can still study today has remained entirely unaffected by external trade, but the impact has occurred in very different ways and with very different results. We should first recall the already mentioned fact that even though inside money frequently circulates as a real monetary instrument only within a tribe, it is often not produced by the tribe itself but imported as a commodity from a neighboring area. The difficulty of obtaining it. One of the most desirable characteristics of inside money is thereby to some extent guaranteed. Once a means of payment has been accepted by the tribe in question, it behaves entirely like a proper inside money, serving both commerce and social tasks within the society, while it loses its significance for any trade outside of it. Each district in Abyssinia, for instance, possessed its own pearl money, which had its own name, and was brought into the country through trade but circulated as money only within the district. The agate beads circulating as means of payment in Darfur and Kordofan came from India, but especially pearls in their double meaning as jewelry and money are subject to the influences of fashion, which is stimulated by the abundant supply of the trade and changes in capricious ways. This causes rapid changes in pearl fashions and thus in the internal currency among numerous African tribes. Even in Tabora, where the pearls are hardly used as jewelry anymore and only serve as a means of payment, these capricious changes in taste are still at work. Many voyages to Africa have failed partly because the pearls taken along proved to be worthless, either because they did not appeal to the taste of the natives or because a change in fashion had occurred since the last contact with European travelers. The unfashionable pearls can then at best be given away as gifts, but they cannot be used for buying and trading. Not infrequently, traders will deliberately seek to promote the widespread introduction of inside money and thereby temporarily achieve great profits. The consequence, of course, is usually a rapid devaluation of the money and the breakdown of the small social organism in whose veins suddenly too much blood circulates. The cowrie shell has probably been exported most frequently as a commodity that then circulates as money in certain districts, in this case generally without too many adverse effects, since the territory in which it was accepted tended to expand simultaneously. The vast quantities of cowries that are in circulation in West Africa all originate from the Maldives or East Africa and have been introduced in countless shiploads by European merchants. China must have obtained its cowrie shells, which formerly served as money there, via seaborne trade as well. It has already been mentioned how European captains enabled the inhabitants of the Caroline Islands of Yap to acquire enormous pieces of their favored stone money. The dentalium money of the Northwest American natives was completely devalued through the massive import of shells and now only serves as jewelry. The shell itself was only brought into the country after attempts to introduce porcelain imitations had failed. Even the copper plates used as money in the same area were imitated, but the new pieces are not nearly as highly valued as the authentic old exemplars. Such imitations and counterfeits have often been attempted, though usually without success, as the fraud was quickly detected and the peculiar relations of inside money to customs and superstitions prevented their adoption. European traders had the most luck with an imitation of the wampum money of the North American natives, which was initially very scarce and perhaps only became a universally used means of payment in some places as a result of the substantial supply from outside, although it then also gradually lost its value. Wampum made from porcelain was at first rejected but gained acceptance over time. Yet, trade will always tend to create its own media for commercial transactions, which it usually does not take from the inside monies but selects from among the trade goods. This is how new types of money develop which do not have to fulfill social tasks within the tribe but are just meant to facilitate the exchange of goods and enable clearly structured prices. The fact that this development does not proceed too quickly and in many cases has not progressed beyond the initial stages is explained by the emergence of trade relations in general, which we should now have a cursory look at. Nearly everywhere where we find primitive tribes engaged in trade, we observe reciprocal gift-giving taking place as an important and indispensable practice. This is particularly noticeable in Africa, where European travelers definitely need to expect this custom. In newly explored areas, whose inhabitants have not yet been influenced by European or Arab business principles, trade recedes to the background altogether. The traveler sends his gift to the chief who in turn reciprocates with food and shelter. That is, if the natives are at all benevolent. Such gifts are not considered part of a business deal but are seen as signs of friendship. Here a cultural stratum reveals itself to us in which one cannot speak of trade in the strict sense. Instead, only two types of encounters between neighboring tribes are conceivable: the warlike, where loot is violently sought, and the amicable, which is reinforced by the exchange of gifts. Conditions of this kind can still be observed today. Gisborne asserts of the Maori that they originally had no concept of trade. Rather, being at war was the normal state, while tribes related in friendship gave each other gifts. In addition, hospitality, in the broadest sense, was practiced. Micronesian trade has also been described as an exchange of gifts, and Sivas says of the Ahuacas, they accustom themselves with difficulty to the system of buying and selling. With gifts, one achieves more than with money, although they gladly take the latter, but bury it or pass it on to their women in the form of necklaces. Remnants of this idea are to be found particularly in Africa, and a few examples may illustrate how trade in certain places has not yet become what we usually understand it to be. The beginnings of the Arab trade with the Wahuma states described by Emin Pasha are very instructive. It is the practice in Unioro, as well as in Uganda, for every trader on his arrival to present about the half of his goods, especially powder, lead, shot, and guns, to the ruler, who in return places at his disposal a house and garden, and gifts of cattle and fruit, and finally, at his departure, makes him a present of ivory, the value of which usually amounts to 5 times that of the original present. Both parties make a good thing out of the transaction. The Arab, who so capital brings him a return without any trouble to himself, and the king, who pays nothing for the ivory. since it is supplied by his faithful subjects. The Arabs thus skillfully adapted to the prevailing ideas. According to the testimony of Leo Africanus, the merchants who arrived at the court of the king of Georgia practiced a very similar gift trade by handing over their goods to the king and receiving counter gifts worth double or triple in value. Likewise, in German Southwest Africa, the first merchants to appear in the country seem to have opened trade through gifts. The golden age of Amereru, Bulow says, was the 60s and 70s. Back then, white hunters had lavishly gifted away guns and ammunition, clothes and alcohol, horses and food, to receive ostrich feathers and ivory in return that were brought in through the hunting activities of the natives. Now the trade has declined and consists of the retail sale of food and clothing for oxen and sheep. Generally, the custom of opening and also closing trade with gifts has been preserved as a remnant of the exchange of gifts, so that business deals, wherein pleasantries come to a halt even in Africa, are, as it were, framed by this older amicable custom. In former times, reciprocal gifting was a prelude to any barter trade on the Gabon, and similar East African customs are reported in detail by Reichard. At the Niger River Delta, the opening of a commercial transaction by presenting gifts to the chief was termed break the trade. Again and again we find the custom that the less powerful or the stranger who has a distinct request, gifts first, and the other then reciprocates the gift as he sees fit. The gift is at first just a pure sign of peace and friendship, its material value of secondary importance. While taxes arise from the voluntary gifts of subjects, trade duties and tariffs gradually emerge from the gifts of foreigners and travelers, to which we will return soon. These, too, are basically remnants of an older social innovation, which is adapted to entirely new purposes and can sometimes bring about the very opposite of the original custom. The old custom reoccurs in other remnants as well. For instance, in Kano, it was customary for the seller to return 2% of the paid purchase price to the buyer because such a gift would bring blessings. And the strange practice of always paying only half of the agreed price prevalent amongst the Yoruba is likely based on similar views. The Luba frequently give something extra when completing a trade deal, called a mukalo. The traffic in gifts has transformed into a form of social courtesy in Tibet and Mongolia, where certain silk scarves are exchanged frequently as greeting gifts. On the other hand, guest gifts often become a heavy burden, and even offer a pretext for extortions that utterly destroy the beautiful essence of the old custom. Kijis chiefs in Turkestan used to demand that caravans make a stop at each one of them and reciprocate their hospitality with disproportionate counter gifts. In Africa, trade is often completely paralyzed by the exorbitant gift demands made by the chiefs. However, trade relations can, it seems, not only develop from the amicable traffic of gifts, but also from its opposite, war. That is, in principle, to be expected. Just as the individual person in primitive conditions must be capable of solving a multitude of tasks from which the civilized person is spared by the division of labor. Early human societies are organisms that must satisfy their essential needs self-sufficiently and have to stand their ground in the struggle for survival by adapting to natural conditions. These conditions, whether favorable or unfavorable, create differences that arouse envy and desire. One tribe has fish-rich waters at its disposal, another has an abundance of certain fruits, a third exploits salt deposits or salt springs. Typically, the initial thought is usually not to obtain a share of these special riches peacefully but to try to seize them through bloody fights. Tacitus reports about the battle between the Chatti and the Hermundari that erupted over the ownership of saline springs and ended with the victory of the latter. The sources of highly prized earth pigments in northwestern America were often battled over in wild fights, and the famous sacred pipestone quarries, once the common property of all surrounding native tribes, were ultimately violently seized by the Sioux. Weak tribes facing the threat of being wiped out by stronger ones often attempt to buy mercy by surrendering a portion of their possessions, and from this one-time gift, a regular tribute can easily develop. If the more powerful tribe offers counter-gifts, the seeds of trade are present, albeit a form of trade always inclined to suddenly change back into its initial form. In some regions, development has not even advanced this far. Bock characterizes the conditions in the interior of Borneo, perhaps somewhat sweepingly, with these words: trade in its most embryonic state hardly existed, for no man would think of giving anything in exchange for an article that he coveted, sufficient for him that he was strong enough to gain it by force, by murder if need be, and to keep it by virtue of his reputation as a head hunter. Venayukov aptly portrays how robbery and other forms of exchange sometimes maintain a close relationship. In the eyes of the Turkmens, a stranger is essentially a legitimate victim, and if he appears rich enough and defenseless, his fate is to be robbed. In those cases where the Turkmens cannot rob a stranger, their aim is to extract as much money as possible from him in trade, to beg for as many gifts as possible, or finally to steal from him. Robbery and violence appear as the more honorable acts, while buying and paying seem low and unworthy. Moltke's habit of paying for everything during the military campaign in Kurdistan provoked the disapproval and astonishment of his Turkish companions, for whoever is able, takes without money. A form of trade that takes place without previously establishing friendly relations is the silent trade, during which buyers and sellers do not interact closely or at least do not communicate with each other. It has been frequently described since ancient times and still occurs today. Whether this form develops directly out of warfare or is an independent method of initiating trade relations shall not be examined here. It is entirely possible that in some places, it is also a regression from more advanced conditions. More undeniable is the close connection between piracy and trade, as it is typical of the ventures of aspiring seafaring nations, be they called Phoenicians, Portuguese, or English. In all these beginnings, a need for a general medium of exchange and measure of value is not yet clearly present, and inside money, if it exists at all, has nothing to do with the matter. A look at the primitive native tribes of Guyana described to us vividly by Everard Imthern teaches us how regular trade relations can even emerge in simple circumstances without money. Each tribe has some manufacture peculiar to itself, and its members constantly visit the other tribes, often hostile, for the purpose of exchanging the products of their own labor for such as are produced only by the other tribes. These trading Indians are allowed to pass unmolested through the enemy's country. Of the tribes on the coast, the Warhorse make far the best canoes and supply these to the neighboring tribes. In the same way, far in the interior, the Wapinas build boats for all the tribes in that district. The Macusis have two special products which are in great demand amongst all the tribes. One is the early used for poisoning arrows and the darts of blowpipes. The other is an abundance of cotton hammocks. The Aracunas, Peman, grow, spin, and distribute most of the cotton which is used by the Macusis and others for hammocks and other articles. The Aracunas also supply all blowpipes, for these are made of the stems of a palm which, growing only in and beyond the Venezuelan boundary of their territory, are procured by the Aracunas, doubtless by exchange, from the Indians of the native district of that palm, etc. The inviolability of the traders nicely points to the emergence of trade from the exchange of friendship gifts. Even the initial forms of intermediary trade are already present, for the exchanged goods are not exclusively used for one's own needs but are brokered again to other tribes. A quite lively trade is thereby carried out in the simplest manner, without the need for money in our sense. Perhaps the conditions in Guyana have stalled at this stage for so long because inside money never emerged among the local native tribes, likely due to their unique social development. In a sense, the products with which the various tribes trade may be referred to as the beginning of their money, but of a type of outside money, the fundamental significance of which is as a means of exchange. A Macusi who crafts many cotton hammocks thereby indeed obtains money with the help of which he can buy all the products of neighboring tribes and, because of the middlemen, even those of more distant tribes, the character of commodities as a kind of money becomes even more pronounced in the actual intermediary trade. Someone can, for example, amass a lot of salt, which he neither produced himself nor intends to use, yet it still has a value for him. If the commodity is durable, highly desired, and easily marketable, it will be gladly accepted in payment and will eventually be equated with inside money, wherever the latter has already developed into a determining factor of social life. Thereby, the barrier that proper inside money had established between individual tribes and nations collapses. The previously separate tasks of inside money and outside money blend into one another, their capacities complementing each other. The result is what we recognize as the money of civilized nations, that indispensable tool of social life and trade. Occasionally this fusion can still be observed in its initial stages. On the Caroline Islands of Yap, there exists a well-defined inside money that circulates only within the social community, whereas in the external trade with neighboring islands mostly bundles of turmeric are used, which are exchanged for loin belts, sails, twine, and jewelry made of coconut shells. As an intermediate form between inside and outside money, specific ornamental and other items can be used to purchase commodities in internal transactions, yet they are not able to fulfill the crucial social tasks of an actual inside money. Sometimes, however, such a hybrid money, misscheduled, is added to the original inside money as a supplement during payments, foreshadowing further developments. With the introduction of outside money, the number of types of money increases by countless practical goods. However, the boundary between the concepts of commodity and money will always remain more or less blurry in the case of outside money. Then again, certain types of inside money that gain widespread acceptance can spread over vast areas and, in addition to their other qualities, acquire value as a medium of exchange, thereby becoming a more ideal form of money than any of those that arise from pure barter could ever become. The concept becomes blurred when money is transformed into a mere ornament or vice versa. In contrast, inside money that does not achieve a significance for trade will gradually perish. When considering questions of this kind, it must not be forgotten that reversions are possible, and simple forms of commerce may resurface in the absence of a better means of exchange, even in places where developments had long gone beyond that. For example, in Paraguay, during the time of the Jesuit missions, the scarcity of cash caused the resurgence of organized barter. Should a Spanish woman, writes Dobres her for need tallow candle, she sends along her black slave a basket with some cotton tobacco, Paraguayan, tea, sugar, and salt. The seller of the candles then selects whatever they like from it, but according to an established law of prices. The prices of all natural productions are regulated by the magistrates, and are diligently learnt and observed both by the seller and the purchaser. The second source of the concept of money can now be succinctly defined in the following manner. Outside money is a commodity that is universally welcomed, easily sold, can be stored for a long time due to its durability, and, as a consequence, is capable of serving as a medium of commercial trade. As it transforms into a measure of value and a valuable property, it becomes an ideal type of money. This usually happens through the influence of inside money, which in turn is soon displaced or transformed and its effectiveness extended by outside money. Combined, they constitute money as it is understood by true civilizations. The fusion of outside money with inside money, or the transformation of the former into the latter, often proceeds in a way that parallels the emergence of inside money, while the gifts to the powerful, and subsequently fines and taxes, initiate the circulation of alienable private property, which is then finally transformed into a general means of payment. The voluntary and involuntary gifts of the traders, namely the market and customs duties, bring substantial amounts of certain trade goods into a chief's possession, and thereby enable, like inside money, the accumulation of wealth and the filling up of the treasuries of the powerful. The fact that tariffs initially appear in the innocuous form of gifts can still be confirmed in many cases. Certain tariffs may, however, also be regarded as moderations of the original practices of complete plundering or even killing. The European merchants on the African coast at first gave gifts to the chiefs for permission to trade with their subjects, but these voluntary offerings soon became customs, cartoons, and in effect regulated tariffs, while only minor and variable supplements maintained the pretense of voluntary gifting. Among the taxes that had to be paid in the gum trade along the Senegambian coast, one emerged that carried the classic name of the obligatory gift, a term which, in only 2 words, illuminates the whole course of the development. Alongside market duties and transit fees, we also find other taxes that predominantly burden the merchants and are common among both primitive tribes and civilized nations. These include bridge and ferry tolls, for which there is abundant evidence from Africa. For instance, Serpa Pinto observed the bridge toll in Bengela's hinterland. According to Eberstein, it is customary in the coastal region of Kilwa and Pabutna, in Angola. Close to Zaminiasso in the land of the Bambara, there was a bridge which was overseen by 2 guards who collected tolls from all foreigners while the locals were exempted. Ferry tolls are mentioned even more frequently, multiple times by Cameron, from Dahomey by Reed, and so on. Additionally, other privileges must be paid for as well. Butner, for instance, had to pay a toll for using a newly constructed road. Lander found that road tolls were customary in Yorubaland, and in the land of the Bari, Mano was asked to pay a fee for the shade of a tree under which he camped. A payment for the permission to graze salt grass was noted by passage from Adamoa. It is self-evident that traders initially pay their dues with a portion of the commodities they carry with them, even more so because these commodities must already be partly considered a kind of money. However, occasionally, there are also demands for all tariffs to be paid in the form of a very specific commodity, which forces the merchants to always carry some of this commodity, even if they do not intend to trade with it. In some places in East Africa, for example, the toll must be paid in the form of iron hooks, all of which come from Usukuma, along Lake Victoria. Even in medieval Germany, ship tolls were required to be paid in specific goods, irrespective of what the cargo of a ship consisted of. In the hinterland of Senegambia, tariffs must usually be paid in cowries despite the fact that other money substitutes exist and no stable currency yet dominates. Certain toll stations on the lagoon of Huida only accept rum as payment, and so on. The desire to gradually separate the more suitable kinds from the overwhelming abundance of types of outside money and to allow only a limited number to simultaneously serve as a measure of value and a means of exchange, shows itself to be efficacious everywhere. 8. The fusion of inside and outside money. Like nature, the mind does not make abrupt leaps but instead gradually adapts to new conditions and only learns to fully exploit the tools it has forged over time. Money is one such tool that is still occasionally employed with a degree of clumsiness, and it unmistakably bears the traces of its double origin, even though it has long since become something unified. While a main characteristic of civilized money is that it allows one to buy anything available for sale, this attribute is, actually, artificially conferred upon it or applies primarily to certain types of money, specifically to precious metals or, in countries operating under a pure gold standard, exclusively to gold. You cannot buy a house with a mountain of small copper coins, as no one is obligated or inclined to accept such an inconvenient mass of money. It is only through the ability to convert these small coins into precious metals that the unlimited purchasing power of money is established, at least within the confines of a given state. This difficulty, which is one of the main causes of our endless currency controversies, is also not adequately overcome by less civilized societies. It is mainly outside money that suffers from this difficulty, but inside money is not exempted either, for the simple reason that it often exists in such large and indivisible pieces that it can only be used to purchase very valuable things. As a result, its owners can easily find themselves in a position analogous to a man who has no loose change and only a 1,000-mark note that no one can break. This often gives rise to a specific custom where certain objects can only be bought with particular types of money, making it entirely pointless to offer small change for them. For instance, cowrie shells instead of cattle. As mentioned above, it is the system of outside money which struggles far more frequently with this difficulty, as the notion of commodity is, more or less firmly, always linked to outside money. The thought that they are not actually buying but bartering remains firmly entrenched in the minds of traders. Even where a regular currency has been introduced, people may find it difficult to become accustomed to the universal means of payment. In the days of Heinrich Barth, cowrie shells were accepted as a measure of value in Bornu, and Maria Theresa Thaler were in circulation. Yet despite this, it was at times very difficult to purchase food in the Kukua marketplace. A small farmer, Barth writes, will on no account take his payment in shells, and will rarely accept a Maria Theresa dollar. The person, therefore, who wishes to buy corn, if he has only dollars, must first exchange a dollar for shells, or rather buy shells. Then with the shells he must buy a kalugu or shirt, and, after a good deal of bartering, he may thus succeed in buying the corn. The fatigue to be undergone in the market is such that I have very often seen my servants return in a state of utmost exhaustion. Conditions are more favorable when specific commodities are brought into a simple and stable ratio with one another. An interesting primitive example of value measurement is when a certain measure or weight of one commodity is equated to the same measure or weight of another, essentially weighing one against the other. Burton notes that in his time, sea salt on the African coast was sold in exchange for an equivalent amount of hulkus, grain, and, likewise, for an amount of hulkus, the same amount of cowrie shells was dispensed. If salt production yielded little, its price was simply doubled. The fact that valuable things were once worth their weight in gold among us is evidenced by this still commonly used saying. In West Africa, this practice can still be observed, especially with the rare agri beads, which are often paid for in gold equal to or even double their weight. One frequently encounters the belief that certain valuable commodities can only be acquired with a means of payment whose significance somehow corresponds to them. It is not the quantity of money that is crucial, but the quality. In Africa, slaves, in particular, often cannot be purchased with the common means of exchange used to procure daily necessities. Instead, very specific and precious objects, such as ivory, firearms, or gunpowder, must form at least part of the purchase price. When purchasing ivory in Angola, gunpowder and firearms are also indispensable. According to Liechtenstein, the Tswana did not sell cattle for tobacco but demanded iron or cloth in return, while their cloaks could only be exchanged for live cattle. The sacred pots of the Dayaks can only be acquired with gold dust, agate stones, and slaves. Spears among the Chaga are almost only exchanged for firearms. Other goods are only reluctantly and exceptionally accepted. A black man who wanted to sell his knife to Butner for fabrics was prevented from doing so by his fellow villagers. According to Nebaut's testimony, the Dakpa along the upper Ubangi River also adhered to an unusual system of trade. They sold their manioc exclusively for a specific kind of fabric, but if one wanted any other food products, one had to offer cowries, pearls, lead, and other types of fabrics. In West Africa, gold cannot be readily exchanged for just any commodity. In the region of Bambouc, for instance, one cannot receive gold in return for glassware, tobacco, clothes, or liquor. These items could only be bartered for food products. Gold was handed over exclusively in exchange for fabrics, salt, or amber. The emergence of such idiosyncrasies is unsurprising and tightly intertwined with the evolution of outside money. When one tribe interacts with another, exchanging, for example, pots for arrows, the firm idea easily takes hold that arrows must always and everywhere be paid for with pots, and that other goods or types of money are unsuitable for this purpose. In Australia, a particular tribe exploits a greenstone quarry and accepts spears in exchange for the much desired mineral. Thus, greenstone can only be purchased with spears. Another tribe trades its eels for roots. A third one swaps its shields for belts. And so someone who has caught many eels can indeed amass a large quantity of edible roots in return, but certainly not a shield. A delightful illustration of the emergence of such exchange values is found in Culler's account. Sailors landing at the mouth of the Niger River typically take with them one of the abundant gray parrots found there, and since they customarily exchange these birds for one of their shirts with the locals, a steadfast tradition has developed that a red sailor's shirt must be paid for with a parrot. That inside money can also develop in a similar manner has already been noted. Finch describes 3 types of shell money from New Ireland, each possessing a distinct purpose. The first type, Cockainan Lului, is used in everyday transactions and is most often used for peacemaking. The natives are known to carry strings of this shell money, tied to their hair, to make small purchases or to ransom themselves in the event of an attack. The second type, Cockainan, is of higher value than the preceding one and is predominantly used to acquire women. The third type is the most valuable. It is particularly used for the purchase of women, canoes, and so on, and is valid along the entire northwest coast. According to Kubery, similar conditions prevail on the Palau Islands, where the various types of ancient pearl money have been brought together into an intricate system. Taro, oil, syrup and tobacco are paid for with the usual Mor or Kamo and Matal o Adalobok. But if you want to buy a sale, you have to give an Adalobok of the important type. If one is to pay the matrimonial contribution dictated by custom, one must give a money piece corresponding to one's social rank, and so forth in numerous matters. Therefore, if someone has a payment to make, he must ask all his acquaintances and eventually secure a loan against collateral to change or convert a large piece of money is an intricate affair, sometimes nearly impossible. The lack of a stable unit of value causes all sorts of attempts to somehow regulate the prices of the more valuable items with the help of the different types of money that coexist next to one another independently, usually in such a way that the purchase cannot be made with a single kind of money but that several must be present in certain proportions. Fisher, for instance, paid the Marseille 30-40 pieces of iron wire rings, 10 brass wire rings and 40-100 strings of beads for each ox, and 1.5 loads of iron wire, 50 brass wire rings, 600 strands of beads and 14 war cloaks as an atonement for several Marseillais who fell in battle. The prices in the ivory and slave trade on the West African coast tend to be even more diverse. On every tooth, tusk, if it be of any considerable size, says Wilson, he must have so many muskets, kegs of powder, brass pans, copper rods, wash basins, plates and gun, flints, the whole number not being less than 30, and these must be reduplicated in proportion to the size of the tooth. If it should weigh as much as 100 pounds, the seller would not expect less than 10 of each of these articles. This is what is called the round trade. It is carried on by a most tedious, and, to novices, a most annoying process. In this way, the concept of money becomes elusive again, as the countless means of exchange which captivate and confuse the black African's desire prevent the emergence of a stable measure of value, while European types of money remain incomprehensible to the natives because of their own conventional value. In such circumstances, purely imaginary measures of value emerge, which are a particularly developed feature of West Africa but occur elsewhere as well. Typically, a certain quantum of the most frequently traded commodity is used to set the unit, named arbitrarily, and then used as a measure for all values. The best known, the crew, which serves as a measure of value in Cameroon, originally corresponded to a specific amount of palm oil, and has recently been equated to 20 German imperial marks. On the coast of Sierra Leone, the bar, iron bar, was introduced as a measure of value, and the round from Cape Mesurado to Cape Palmas. In Bonny the bar was in use, called inch or ach by the natives, and corresponded to, for instance, 5 heads of tobacco or a flint rifle. In Angola, the piece, pesa, or long was common. At Ambrizite, the musket, fusil, is the exclusive measure of value for the ivory trade, while for other commodities, it is a piece of cotton fabric. This odd method of calculating prices, which certainly requires an infinite patience during trade negotiations, is not entirely unappealing to the European merchant, as he can reap significant profits by skillfully manipulating the price ranges, while never showing the blacks the cards he is dealing with. A related phenomenon is observed amongst the Jiliak, who imported the Chinese unit of value and calculate according to it without using the Chinese coins on which it is based. The many different imaginary measures of value among civilized societies in part developed out of these simple beginnings. 9. Overview of primitive money. Ornament money in general. Shell money. Several varieties of primitive money have already been mentioned. To truly grasp their development, it is essential to provide a systematic overview, which undoubtedly presents its own challenges, especially when striving for a clear understanding of the conditions. The phylogenetic classification into inside money, outside money, and sign money, and so on, does not directly offer an overview of the entire subject matter, because in many cases it is still impossible to trace the development of individual monetary instruments and to assign them a definite position within this framework. Alternatively, a simple classification based solely on the external attributes of the means of payment is too superficial, as it conceals the internal relations and leads to a flawed understanding. The term iron money, for example, encompasses not only crude metal bars but also hoes, shovels, spearheads, and even ornamental iron beads, things that have only their material in common. Nevertheless, for many types of money emerging from trade, a classification based on material is quite appropriate, and for others, it is at least preferable for the time being. It is thus probably best to strike a middle ground. We can, first of all, sort out the historically well-defined group of types of ornament money, which, with very few exceptions, either are a type of inside money or have emerged from one. If this broad category is to be divided further, then it is only proper to do so by material differences, resulting in subcategories such as shell money, pearl money, metal money, and so forth. Apart from ornament money, the second broad category encompasses all useful items, hence it might aptly be termed use money, which could further be divided into foodstuffs, luxuries, various utensils and tools, and even includes livestock, and slave money. Its internal opposition to the first category is based upon the fact that it predominantly developed out of outside money, Between these two main categories, we find fabric money, which is sometimes primarily considered as an adornment and sometimes more as a useful commodity, and, consequently, is more or less subject to the changing influences of fashion and sentiments, influences that have a striking effect on jewelry and, partly, on the money derived from it. With this in mind, we can attempt to provide a very brief overview of primitive types of money, as we turn our attention to ornament money and, more specifically, to its most important variety, shell money. Another differentiation becomes essential. Shells used as ornaments and money either remain unprocessed except perhaps for simple perforations for the purpose of stringing, or are transformed into discs or other arbitrarily shaped pieces through more or less tedious forms of work. The difference between these subcategories is not very clear, but undeniably significant. The most famous and most widely distributed among all minimally or completely unprocessed shells is the cowrie shell, which is actually a type of sea snail, Cypria moneta. The fact that it managed to conquer such an extensive territory is even more remarkable considering that it originally could only be harvested in a single location in the Indian Ocean, near the Maldives, from where it could be exported to the remotest regions, because that location was near an ancient maritime trade route. In more recent times, according to al-Masudi, not later than the 10th century, a shell closely related to the cowrie, Cypria annulus, began to be extensively traded in large quantities from the East African coast, and circulated especially in West Africa, valued on par with Cypria moneta. Cowries were also reportedly exported from Bima Island near Sulawesi in the East Indian archipelago and, according to Antonio de Morga's accounts, from the Philippines, from where they appear to have been sent primarily to Indochina. Details regarding cowrie extraction in the Maldives can be found in the older writings of Arab scholars, later complemented in desirable ways by François Pirard. Branches or coconut leaves were thrown into the water for the snails to attach themselves to, and harvesting was done twice a month. The cowries were packaged in baskets of 12,000 and predominantly exported to Bengal, where they were exchanged for rice. In the time of Ibn Battuta, they were sent in bulk to Yemen and from there probably to the Sahel. Within the Maldives, the shells circulated as small change, while more significant payments were conducted with silver. It is very remarkable that the cowrie never served as money on the neighboring Malabar coast and in Ceylon. There is no doubt that the export of cowries from the Maldives has been in full swing since ancient times, involving, apart from the island's inhabitants, Arab traders from early on and likely also the Chinese. Later, the Portuguese seized this lucrative trade, transporting the shells not only to Siam and Bengal but also to the West African coast. The Dutch soon followed suit, replicating their success. Most recently, German merchants also extracted substantial profits from this trade, especially when they introduced the cheaper East African shells en masse to the West African coast, until the inevitable devaluation occurred and ended the business. There is already a small body of literature about the cowrie. Volz's history of shell money deals almost exclusively with it. Andre and Eilhoff dedicate a part of their essays to it, and Hertz has recently dealt with the topic quite extensively. At this point, it may suffice to provide a brief overview of its past and its current distribution, which do not entirely coincide. Over time, the cowrie has lost vast provinces of its domain but in return has conquered new ones. It is very odd how the shell's appreciation as money, on the one hand, and as an ornament, on the other, relate to each other. While the cowrie is no longer used as a means of payment in some regions, it persists as an adornment. Elsewhere it was introduced as a popular ornament before it was thought to be used as money, and in yet other areas, it is practically only used as money and is not at all popular as an ornament. It may be mentioned in passing that the cowrie circulates as money in two forms, namely in the form of individual pieces counted or measured by volume, and as strung together on threads. The first form appears to be more common and is currently found, for instance, in Bengal, Siam, the Hausa states, and several parts of West Africa, where colonial trading posts, as in Porto Novo, employ native women as shell counters. The second one was once common in China but also appears quite frequently in Africa. Stringing a specific number of cowries together somewhat corresponds to the minting of our metal money, also in the sense that a sum akin to seigniorage is often deducted for this stringing process. In Dahomey, for example, cowries generally circulate unstrung, with only the king making payments using cowrie strings prepared by his wives, A single string is supposed to contain 2,000 cowries, but in reality, it contains only 1,500, with the difference being the labor cost for stringing. According to more recent information, groups of 30-35 shells are sewn into palm leaves but are valued as if they were 40. Similarly, as one moves inland, the increasing price of the shells is reflected in the reduced number on each string. In the interior of Dahomey, according to Duncan, a string contains only 33 cowries instead of the usual 40, and a head only 47 strings instead of 50. The individual sources are not in agreement with each other, as they originate from very different time periods, but they might still help to clarify similar facts elsewhere, such as in Timbuktu, where, according to Lenz, cowries are counted in a way such that 5 sets of 16, 5 times 16, are considered equivalent to 100. Regarding the area of the distribution of cowries, they have been in circulation as money in Bengal since at least the 1st century of our era and are still occasionally used for this purpose. The claim that exports from the Maldives to South Asia began in the 17th century must actually refer to the renewal of the trade. Today, large quantities of cowries still circulate in the interior areas of Indochina, especially in Siam, but in the East Indies, they have been retained only in the Philippines. The shell money, however, has bit by bit lost an enormous area of distribution in Asia and Europe, but it is difficult to define the precise boundaries of this area since cowries likely also spread to countries where they were never used as money but only as mere ornaments and trade items. It is certain that they served as small change in Arabia, and the same can probably be assumed for Persia. In contrast, archaeological finds in the Caucasus and eastern Turkestan, as well as the even more striking finds from prehistoric graves in northern Europe, including northern Germany, England, Scandinavia, and Livonia, do not allow us to conclude that cowries were used as money. At least, one can estimate how highly the cowrie was valued as an ornament by noting that it traveled from the Indian Ocean to the Baltic Sea, likely as a means of exchange in the amber trade. The existence of a cowrie currency is definitely attested for in China and Japan, although it is more than likely that Cypria moneta initially only established itself alongside other shells from the China Seas and either displaced or mixed with these in economic life. Apparently, strings of shells, already mentioned in the Shijing, and turtle shells were the earliest Chinese money. The character pei, shell, is used to form compound words that signify wealth and the like. China's history is replete with monetary experiments, and amid the frequent changes in currency, cowries seem to be demonetized at one moment and reintroduced at another, although they actually continued to circulate unimpeded until they finally had to give way to silver and strung copper coins, which were probably imitations of the strings of shells. In the south, the cowrie persisted the longest. Marco Polo mentions them several times when describing his travels through Assam and southwestern China, noting that the shells originated from India. The province of Yunnan paid a tribute of 5,769 strings of shells as late as 1,578, but over the course of the same century, and after massive amounts of American silver had flowed into the country, the cowrie currency was officially disposed of here too. In Tibet, silver had begun to displace cowrie shells from the 12th century. The enormous reduction of the area of circulation of the cowrie shell was largely balanced out by its expansion into Africa. Since Hertz and André have dealt with the African circumstances in detail, a few notes and additions are sufficient here. It is certainly striking that, although the cowrie originates from the East and even though some of the shell money is produced in East Africa, its dissemination currently almost exclusively proceeds from the West Coast. By the way, we have to make a sharp distinction here between the use of the cowrie as jewelry, observable in almost all regions of Africa, and its use as small change. What spreads from the east coast to the interior seems to serve almost exclusively as jewelry, while the cowrie currency marches towards the interior from the west coast. In Timbuktu, Leo Africanus had already found the cowrie used as a coin in the early 16th century, and it was mentioned even earlier in Arabic reports. It appears that there was once a substantial dissemination of cowries from East and perhaps North Africa, which gradually declined and was replaced by the one from West Africa. The East African cowries also have been mostly redirected to the West Coast recently, although some, at least a few decades ago, still found their way to Unyamwezi and further inland. In Denham's time, 1820s, The eastern boundary of the Kauri territory lay just beyond the city of Katagum, but the strong influx via West Africa allowed the ruler of Bornu in 1840, and later the one of Bajirmi, to introduce the Kauri currency in their states, thereby establishing a stable measure of value. The king of Bornu opted for this regulation only after he had made an unsuccessful attempt to mint coins in Europe at his expense. Further to the east, cowries are highly prized as jewelry but are only exceptionally used as money. The fact that pearls and cowrie shells are considered essential components of the bride price among the Luo in the Upper Nile region might be viewed as a step towards their transformation into money. The amount of relief brought about by the introduction of the thaler and cowrie currency to the Sahel's perplexing money market, with its numerous and unsuitable types of use money, is illustrated by Nachtigal's remark. The process of counting involved in exchanging the Maria Theresa dollar for its equivalent in cowries is indeed a tedious and time-consuming business. Against this toil and unavoidable inaccuracy, there is the advantage of being able to obtain all articles offered for sale in Kuka and its surroundings in exchange for dollars and their cowrie fractions, and of having in the cowries extraordinarily small fractional units of currency, whereas to the markets of the neighboring countries strips of cotton, glass beads, paper, aromatic wood and other articles of small value have to be brought without always being sure that it will be possible, and if so, through what transitional stages, to get in exchange the goods that are wanted. The cotton strips, which are still current alongside the cowries and which to this day at any distance from the capital are the most important medium of exchange, vary considerably in quality, and therefore in value. When I was in Kuka, the average value of one cotton strip was 4 rotel, or about 12 pfennig, so that in very small retail transactions it was necessary, since the cotton strips could not be further subdivided, to substitute for them single pieces of paper, a few glass beads and the like, with the division of the dollar into 4,000 cowries. On the other hand, the minimum unit of value is about 1/10 of a pfennig, so that the poor can purchase in the smallest quantities anything that can be subdivided. Along the west coast, the substantial import of cowries severely depressed their value, as most of the imported shells remained in the coastal regions. In contrast, there was a noticeable scarcity of this small change in the Hausa states even in recent times. On the coast some relief is brought by the fact that large quantities of cowries are often buried during times of war and are not recovered. Forgeries using a small indigenous sea snail are known to occur. From the Sahel, the cowries also penetrated the Congo basin, and are extraordinarily widespread in the area from the equator up to where the Aruwimi River joins the Congo as well as along the Congo's tributaries. To the east, a territory without cowries separates the distribution area of the Congo basin from the East African one. Among the Dzing along the Sankuru River, the shell serves as a coin, while the Tupand primarily use it for ornamentation. In the areas around Equator Station, it is a proper means of payment. Likewise along the Middle Ubangi River, frequently, large quantities of cowries are placed into the graves of the deceased. There are conflicting reports about their presence in the Great Lakes region. The cowrie apparently spread from Unyamwezi to the Wahuma states and has occasionally been used as money but predominantly as jewelry. According to Grant, it circulated as money in Bunyoro and was frequently buried by owners, much like metal money elsewhere. During Emin Pasha's time, the true domain of the cowrie currency was Uganda, where it was introduced and systematically developed under the influence of the Arabs. Cowries were strung together by the 100, and 10 such strings formed a bundle. The shell also circulates along the German coast of Lake Victoria. Chiefs pay cowries as tribute to the German stations. In East Africa, cowries were occasionally used for practical purposes. Their lime was extracted to use for the chewing of tobacco. A similar practice of burning them to produce lime was observed in parts of the Western Sahel. In general, a single cowrie shell has a very low value which, at least in Africa, fluctuates considerably depending on the distance from the coast and the volume of imports. In the coastal parts of Togo in 1894, a pfennig was equivalent to 40 cowries, while in Kita, it equaled only 10 cowries. In Porto Novo, 20,000 cowries equal 5 francs, implying that 1 pfennig equals 50 cowries. During Bath's time, 1850s, in Kano, a Maria Theresa thaler had a value of 2,500 to 3,000 cowries, and of 5,000 in the 1880s, while its value fluctuated between 4,000 and 6,000 in Bornu. In the Kukua market, An egg could be purchased for 8 cowries, and a chicken for 32-160 cowries. In Bosman's time, 1,700, however, a prostitute's wage on the Gold Coast was a mere 3 cowries, which was considered very little even back then, and can only be explained as an old customary price. But it still proves that the amount of circulating shell money must have been relatively insignificant. For comparison, we might add that, according to Schurtz, 1,000 cowries were valued at 35 pfennig in Calcutta, and at 30-35 pfennig in Siam. Around 30 cowries therefore make a pfennig, showing that the cowrie price on the West African coast has been pushed lower than the one in India due to the tremendous influx of Maldivian and especially East African shells. One might assume that the individual cowrie represents such an insignificant value that a division into even smaller change would not be necessary. Yet, there is at least one such case to mention. In the city of Ida along the Niger, groundnuts were used as the smallest coinage, with 4-5 groundnuts for 1 shell. The cowrie still dominates an extensive area today, as this brief overview has shown, but even in the areas it had to retreat from, it still exerted a certain influence, especially in China, where the strung cash seems to be an imitation of strings of shells. Among the Shan in Burma, shell-shaped pieces of silver are in circulation, as was apparently once common in China as well. Gold replicas of cowries were identified by voles on an Ethiopian necklace, and Clem believes that the earliest Etruscan metal coins owe their unique shape to the fact that the cowrie shell was used as a model. Occasionally, the name of the shell still reflects a memory of its old value, as in the case of the Maroons of Suriname, where it is called Papa Money, father of money. The mother of pearl shells that still circulate on the Caroline Islands of Yap are another type of shell money that has not been processed at all or only minimally. The shells are polished on the outer side and pierced at the edges to be strung onto strings. Mother of pearl shells also temporarily served as money in ancient China. The dentalium shells, which apart from being strung on threads were not further processed, served as a means of payment for Northwest Americans for a long time, until their value was pushed down to zero because Europeans imported them en masse. They used to be considered as adornments as well, but after their devaluation they are now viewed exclusively as such. Though the ornamental character of mollusk shells is the foundation of their monetary value, it is intriguing that, by far, not all beautiful shells, which are perfectly suited and often used for ornamentation, transform into money. This is the case not only for unprocessed shells and snails. The effort of manufacturing those types of money that need to be produced by hard work often also seems to be a more important reason for their appreciation than the resulting outcome. The simple grey or white Diwara strings of the New Britons, for instance, are not particularly attractive, at least to European eyes. The most famous type of processed shell money is the wampum of the North American natives, manufactured from Venus mercenaria and occasionally other shells. Depending on the part of the shell from which it was crafted, there was a more valuable red blackish version and a cheaper white variety. Small, polished pearls were arrayed onto strings. Wampum is especially peculiar because it not only served as jewelry and money but also, when embroidered onto belts in specific patterns, as a mnemonic device for messengers and orators, even as a chronicle of individual tribes. Furthermore, it was used as a talisman and as a symbol of war or peace. Apart from wampum, other types of American shell money are mentioned, like those of certain Californian tribes. Strings of shells were also commonly used as money in Venezuela and ancient Yucatan. The shell money varieties of Melanesia and Micronesia form a group on their own, about which Finch has so far provided the most comprehensive reports without, as a lot of news sources indicate, exhausting the object of investigation. The Diwara, primarily found in Blanche Bay on New Pomerania, is made from Nassa calosa and consists of small discs threaded onto strings. A less popular shell money known as apple circulates alongside it, and there also exists a fake Diwara which is used only as a toy for children. On New Mecklenburg, a shell currency similar to Diwara, called Kokkanen, is common in 3 varieties, while other types are present on the island's southwest coast. In southwest New Guinea, the Tortor circulates, likely crafted from either Cassidula or Cypria, pierced twice and threaded on strings. It is absent on the eastern tip, and instead we find strings of red and white shell discs and arm rings made from conus. Tridacna arm rings are, by the way, also found on the Solomon Islands. The sanum used in Finschhofen closely resemble the tortor but seem to be made from a different shell type. Along the Huon Gulf, strung shell discs circulated as valuable money. It should be added to Finch's information that shell monies of various types from the Solomon Islands have recently come into ethnographic collections. Here too, we are dealing with strings of shell discs of which one can distinguish a red and a white variety. The former is worth 10 times the latter on Isabel Island. While these strings circulate as genuine money, they also serve as adornments, and at times the wives of chiefs, covered in all the shell money of their husbands, display themselves to an astonished community. On the Fiji Islands, certain strings of shell are valued as precious assets and heirlooms, though not exactly as proper money. In Micronesia, the old shell money found on Yap is very similar to that which formerly circulated in the Marianas. Strings made of shell and coconut discs were used as adornments and money. Tekororo, on the Gilbert Islands and sporadically also on the New Hebrides. Moreover, in the East Indian archipelago up to Borneo, strings of Nasa discs appear as ornaments and likely also circulated as money originally. Africa possesses a few other types of shell money besides the cowrie. On Fernando Po, there is one produced from Conus papilionaceus, whose individual pieces closely resemble the shape and circumference of larger silver coins, and in Angola, south of the Kwanza River, and Benguela, we observe a type of money threaded on strings that comes from the hinterlands of Benguela and is made from the shells of land snails, Achatina monetaria and Baltita. Its strings are known as Quirandus de Dongo. 10. Other types of ornament money in comparison to shell money. Other forms of ornament money are insignificant, except perhaps for glass beads, which, despite their European origin, have been adopted by many primitive societies and were transformed into a proper inside money. The bead money of the Palau Islands is older and its origins remain unclear. Apparently it was also widespread on Yap in the past and only reached the Palau Islands from there, although it originally came from one of the East Asian civilizations according to Kuberi. The cases of ancient bead money in Africa remain mysterious and unmistakably point to ancient forms of trade. Especially numerous are the so-called agri-beads found on the coast of Guinea. Duncan mentions old beads in Togo that were worth their weight in gold, and, according to Isert, similar beads existed on the Gold Coast. In Katanga, north of Yoruba, they were sold in markets and had a very high price according to Lander. While the old beads are more to be considered a valuable property in these cases, they used to circulate as money along the Kru coast, with each piece worth a Spanish dollar. The Kru claimed that the beads were unearthed by their ancestors in the bush, and they were very skilled in distinguishing genuine beads from European imitations which were, unsurprisingly, also present. The idea that these beads grow in the soil is widespread on the West African coast, apparently because beads are often found when digging up the land and were possibly buried during ancient funerals and the like. Many superstitious beliefs surround these old ornamental objects and enhance their value. They are worn as amulets and one gives children the powder of crushed beads to eat so that they grow faster. For example, a second region in Africa with old bead ornaments is the southeast, a gold area like the west coast, where most of the agri-beads are found in the districts rich in gold. That the gold trade brought these beads to Africa is thus extremely probable. Merensky recounts, when we first visited the Basotho of the northern Transvaal in the year 1860, the natives soon drew our attention to a particular kind of pearl or coral, which was valued highly and worn almost exclusively by ruling chiefs and their wives. In particular, a yellow and a black kind was in high esteem and often served as atonement money or as tribute money, through which the vice chief won the favor or protection of the high chief. Never and nowhere could one buy these beads. Indeed, we were told that a man of low rank, if he possessed such beads, carefully kept them from the eyes of the intrusive, because he would otherwise have to fear that he could arouse the greed of the chiefs and would thus not be sure of his life anymore. All too soon we were asked if we perhaps knew a place in the world where one could buy these gems, seeing that in South Africa one had apparently looked in vain for them among all the traders up to now. According to legend, these beads originated from the land of Boni, situated to the east of Sofala, the old fable rich Mana Motapa. It is rumored that in times gone by they were dug out of the earth there, but the hole, which was created through the excavations, had apparently collapsed later, therefore they are now so scarce. Endman also mentions a type of bead of unknown origin, valued to the utmost by the Sotho in Transvaal. The presence of peculiar ancient beads, found not only in Africa but also in almost every part of the world, proves the significance that certain types of beads must have had for global trade in the past. Whether all these beads stem from a single source, perhaps from Egypt as Andre assumes, or whether most of them, as Tischler tries to show, are of Venetian origin, remains an open question. They, in any case, represent one of the most important and curious traces of an ancient international trade, a type of index fossil of the globe's economic history. Lately, beads, which can be strung and worn in the same way as many forms of shell money, have begun to displace and substitute the latter in some places, like on the Gilbert Islands according to Finch, while blue beads are replacing the old feather money on the Santa Cruz Islands. In Africa, bead money continues to spread, and the efforts of natives to establish a regular currency by favoring certain varieties are evident everywhere, although this is made more difficult by the mass introduction of new and seductive designs. Morgan found glass beads in the hinterland of Cameroon which were the preferred money of women managing the small trade with the caravans. An attempt by King Suuna of Uganda to sew glass beads unfortunately did not yield the anticipated result. However, one should not judge the king too harshly for this fallacy because the belief that beads are plant-based products and either grow in the soil, like the aforementioned agri-beads, or are harvested like fruits, is widely held in Africa. Liechtenstein, for example, could not convince the Corsair that it was not true that beads were cultivated and harvested like grains among distant tribes, while Petherick was often blamed that his beads were unripe and did not yet have the right color. Beads made of clay and stone are also crafted by indigenous people and widely used as ornaments but rarely as money. The megatomus, curved gemstones, of the prehistoric Japanese, which resemble the ornaments of the Ainu, may have been a type of money. From the present word for money among the Seminole, Clay Macaulay infers that they once used stone beads as a means of payment. Stone beads in the largest format include the millstone-like and perforated aragonite blocks of the people of Yap, which, despite their bulkiness, are nothing more than exaggerated ornamental items. They correspond to the stone money of the New Hebrides, made of rings of limestone or feldspar. Coote also mentions stone money from the Solomon Islands, a type of ring made from a kind of marble, that circulates as a coin but is also worn as a talisman on the chest. Gemstones and semi-precious stones are, of course, not to be omitted from the types of money, although they are more suitable to be used as valuables than as an actual circulating medium because of their extreme rarity. Jadeite served as valuable money in ancient China, while agate is still used for this purpose in Borneo. Agate beads imported from India also circulated in Kordofan and Darfur. Lenz found beads made from precious quartz varieties, agate, jasper, etc., in Ujiji, used as a kind of money. Lastly, Amazonite, nephrite, is worth mentioning, which among the Caribs seems to have fulfilled most of the functions of money. It was, for example, used to purchase slaves and circulated in sculpted forms resembling fish and the like. Teeth are a popular ornament and consequently have become proper money here and there. This includes the rare circularly curved boar tusks that, along with dog teeth, function as money on the coast of Kaiser Wilhelmsland. Dog teeth also circulate on the Solomon Islands of Florida and Isabel, dolphin teeth on San Cristobal and Malta, and boar tusks on the Banks Islands. Sperm whale teeth appear as money in Fiji and the Gilbert Islands, and elk teeth among North American natives. Tortoiseshell is certainly only appreciated for the fact that it is an excellent material for crafting ornamental objects, as the use of turtle shells for divination in ancient China alone could hardly have resulted in their inclusion among the measures of value in the Celestial Empire. In any case, it is, alongside shell strings, mentioned as one of the earliest forms of money in China. Tortoiseshell money, threaded onto strings, previously circulated on the Marianas. It was allowed to be produced only at a single location, and at the same time it served as a commemorative token which further increased its value. Feathers from certain birds may have been used as money in the past more frequently than can be established at present. The extraordinary appreciation of some feathers in Polynesia and amongst the ancient civilizations of Central America seems to suggest this. A genuine feather money still circulates on the Melanesian island of Santa Cruz, consisting of the small red feathers that can be found under the wings of a parrot species. Smaller feathers are glued onto larger ones and the latter are then tied together in such a way that only the red remains visible, creating larger continuous pieces whose length determines their value. During festivities, the feather money is unfolded and used to adorn the dancing area. It seems that it is no longer being produced, because Coote only found older pieces whose scarlet color was quite faded on the surface. A similar type of feather money circulates on the Banks Islands, and the red fur from beneath the ears of flying foxes was used in the same way on the Loyalty Islands. The red feathered scalp of a woodpecker, which served the Karuk in California as money alongside shell strings, also belongs to this category. According to Hania, the Bari on the Upper Nile also have a type of feather money, the only example of its kind from Africa. In agreement with older Chinese sources, Marco Polo mentions corals as the money of Tibetans. Among the many money substitutes in the Western Sahel, genuine corals appear as well. Unfortunately, the term coral is indiscriminately used for both glass beads and actual corals in early reports, which makes it difficult to establish the facts. Amber is also popular as money in the Sahel, but in this case, many errors arise from the vague use of the word ambre in French sources and in the compilations drawing from them, because real ambergris appears as a valued money substitute in the same area as well, partly because of its fragrance and partly because it is, like camphor, a sought-after healing substance. Amber undeniably circulated as money in Bambouk, where it was exchanged against the gold produced there. In Bornu, one could formerly use it to purchase goods in the local market. Even cosmetic products circulated as currency, such as antimony powder, which is very popular in the central Sahel, and some time ago red ochre in Usambara. Ornamental forms of money were probably more varied and numerous in the past than they are today, given that a large part of humanity has since adopted the monetary systems of European or Asian civilizations. Especially ornament money, the most genuine form of inside money, easily perishes when a lively external trade emerges, and what we can observe today might therefore just be remnants of previously more common phenomena. Unfortunately, prehistoric finds offer little insight into the problem of the monetary system because it is rarely possible to find out whether various ancient ornaments simultaneously served as money or not. In the case of the seashells that reached deep into the interior of prehistoric Europe, however, it is quite plausible. 11. Metal as ornament and money. While most varieties of ornament money gradually lose their significance, one of them, metal money, asserts its ground all the more and finally pushes its competitors out of the field. This development is not easily traced, as many types of metal money belong to the category of use money while others stand ambiguously between ornament and use money. However, if one keeps in mind the double origin of the monetary system, the main characteristics of this development can be determined with certainty. The English-American theory of utilitarianism, which tries to attribute all pleasure derived from ownership to the practical use of property and truly embodies the cultural perspective of the Anglo-Saxon race, can only understand metals as exceptional resources in the struggle for existence, as convenient materials used to make tools, weapons, and machines. The fact that some less useful metals are particularly valued seems to be caused by their scarcity alone. But when we look at prehistoric remains or at the conditions in the African interior, it turns out that primitive societies make it very difficult for us to decide on whether they value metals more for their utility or because the most brilliant and durable ornaments can be produced from them. The amount of metal shaped into ornaments almost always far outweighs the amount transformed into practical tools. Turning our attention to civilized nations, we find that the inclination towards metallic adornments and pompous ceremonial artifacts has not decreased but that they have just become more selective with regard to the material, so that one no longer wants to wear jewelry made from iron or copper but instead from more beautiful, rarer, and therefore more precious, noble metals. The assumption that metal money initially established itself due to its ornamental properties, and therefore is a true and proper inside money, is thus certainly justified. It is worth recalling how often money made of either noble or base metals appears in the form of large and small rings which can serve as adornment for arms or fingers and can be strung together or sewn onto garments just as easily. Among the Germanic people of the north, precious metals seem to have circulated almost exclusively in ring form for a long time, and one produced smaller pieces by breaking these rings, as evidenced by the honorific title ring breaker, which was given to generous rulers. Rings of gold and silver were also substituted for minted money in ancient Egypt. In gold-rich regions of West Africa, such as Bambouk, mined gold is, even today, immediately shaped by smiths into rings and other ornaments, and is brought into circulation only in this form. In Timbuktu, too, gold circulated in the form of rings and other women's jewelry, but the weight of gold served as the measure of value. The Funj in the Upper Nile region still used gold rings instead of coins in the first half of the 19th century. Where metals are rare, those that are not precious are used for adornment as well. Towards the end of the Bronze Age, even iron appears to have first established itself as an ornamental metal among European societies, and the vast amounts of brass and copper wire imported into Africa also are not designed for practical use but are almost exclusively fashioned into ornaments. However, before this, they circulated in many parts of Africa as real money. Brass wire especially along the Middle Congo and in East Africa, brass rings among the Lemba in Transvaal and elsewhere, and small iron chains, wrought by local blacksmiths, among the Maasai. Regarding the noble metals, there can be no doubt that their suitability for jewelry and ornamental instruments forms the basis of their value, to which their rarity is added as a complementary factor. When one does not consciously keep this in mind, especially when considering the money of European civilizations, it is all too easy to lose the ground under one's feet and drift into theories that are attractive for their simplicity but lack a sound foundation. Metal money made from noble metals is not a pure sign money, it is at the same time a valuable commodity, the value of which depends on supply and demand. In its mature form, it therefore in itself embodies the fusion of inside money with outside money, of the sign of value and valuable property with the means of exchange. The nations that use precious metals as money, moreover, form a closed group within which, at least temporarily, a conventional agreement about the value of their money has to be reached, while realizing that the minted money is valued as a mere commodity and ornament outside of the group. Since a large part of humanity has not at all or has only incompletely adopted the European monetary system, this fact is of the greatest significance. East Asia and India have consistently absorbed large amounts of silver, which has kept the price of silver relatively high despite its substantial levels of production. Other regions, like the Eastern Sahel, in the past also drew in considerable amounts of silver. This uneven attraction to precious metals is directly caused by the initial and most immediate form of appreciation of them, which is the aesthetic one. Fundamentally, it remains a matter of personal or popular taste whether one prefers to use silver or gold for ornamentation, and if gold triumphs in the European monetary system, it owes its victory not so much to its greater scarcity but to the prevalent sense of taste. In remote areas almost uninfluenced by the currents of European culture, the appreciation of these precious metals may be reversed, and indeed gold may even be totally refused while only silver is accepted in trade and crafted into jewelry. Elsewhere, a conventional taste favoring silver does not permit such a rapid and thorough devaluation of silver as is possible in the civilized European states, and as a result, these regions retain the ability to absorb silver in greater quantities than gold. As we are not talking about small corners of the globe here but about densely populated and vast territories, such as East Asia and India, the repercussions for the European monetary market are quite remarkable. Karl von Schurtz has resolutely pointed this out. Since both metals, he says, aside from serving as coinage, are primarily used for luxury purposes, changing fashions may have a decisive influence on the fluctuating purchasing power between the two monetary representatives, an influence to which little attention is paid in the heated debates about the currency question. In the earliest periods of their use, silver was more sought after and more popular, though not priced higher, than gold, and in England, a law existed until the Stuart Restoration stating that no one should be obligated to accept gold as legal tender in amounts less than £20. In our time, East Asia and Africa also display a greater preference for the inferior metal. A few examples can show that even today a pronounced preference for silver frequently exists even though the appreciation of gold has increased in some regions. In China, for example, it seems that gold was hardly in circulation in earlier times, as local Chinese merchants did not accept gold at all during the period when the Spanish took over the Philippines but only silver, while at present gold does possess purchasing power in China. In South Asia, for centuries and until today, silver has been valued slightly higher than it is in Europe. Heckward claims that the Fulbin Futoja law, West Africa, prefer silver over gold, and even in Morocco, gold is often rejected and only silver currency is accepted. This corresponds to the Germanic border tribes' preference for Roman silver coins, about which Tacitus reports. Such cases might partly be explained by the fact that the risk of being deceived by counterfeit coins is greater and more serious with gold than silver, but the inclination to use silver specifically for ornaments is undeniably a decisive factor. Within the entire realm of Islam, gold jewelry very much retreats. It must always be removed during prayer, and pious believers, therefore, do not wear it at all. The effect of this preference on the price of precious metals is remarkable. However, there are still local differences. For instance, gold jewelry is virtually absent in the Western Sahel despite the latter's proximity to the gold countries of the West Coast, whereas it is common in Wade. With the aid of a few examples, it can also be demonstrated that the coined money of Europe is always initially perceived as, or converted into, jewelry by primitive societies, which causes a greater or lesser portion of circulating money to consistently flow out of Europe, depriving it of its original purpose. In the hinterland of Togo, newly introduced German silver money has frequently been accepted as payment, but after that it does not circulate further and is instead used to make silver jewelry. Even the nickel money vanished from circulation for similar reasons. Lander observed that European silver coins were used as jewelry in Nuuk, and in East Africa the silver money of the German East Africa Company is occasionally accepted as payment but soon reworked into jewelry or buried, and it has only really circulated on the coast. Likewise, European silver coins are often transformed into jewelry along the lower Congo River. In Java, significant amounts of Dutch silver money are annually reworked into jewelry and ornaments, while for crafting gold articles, they prefer the reddish English gold coins over the pale yellow Dutch ones. The same holds true for large areas of the Dutch colonial possessions. The Papuans at the Boer Gulf, for instance, also accept Dutch coins willingly and make jewelry out of them. Even in Persia, a part of metal money disappears from commerce because it is reworked into ornaments, and, as a result, Russian coins pour into the country as a substitute. In Tibet, Indian rupees seem to have been initially introduced and worn only as jewelry, until they came to be favored over the frequently forged Chinese silver and were allowed to circulate as actual coins. And in Yemen, Maria Theresa thalers are not only the most important national currency but also a popular ornament. It hardly needs to be noted that coins were often, and here and there still are, used as jewelry in Europe. The delight derived from adorning oneself often aligns with the desire to wear one's valuable possessions on the body to constantly keep a close eye on one's wealth. The Indian women of the poorer classes do not bear the burden of being overloaded with silver jewelry out of sheer vanity but also out of prudence. Similarly, Moorish merchants, according to Maltzan, always wear a large portion of their capital in the form of valuable jewelry. Such unproductive investment of capital is typical of all countries whose populations live in uncertain political circumstances, and of the Orient above all. The condition of all wealth is that it can be moved quickly, says Moltke along similar lines and very aptly, while pointing to the Oriental preference for jewelry. In medieval Europe as well, a tendency prevailed to store up all fortunes in the form of jewelry and pompous ceremonial artifacts which could be melted down as needed. But this was only true as long as the art of goldsmiths was less developed and the value of the object's form was not taken into account. The tragic conflict between this old habit and the demands of an emerging art, which saw its painstakingly crafted masterpieces mercilessly melted down in times of war, was romanticized poetically by Chamisso. When minted money disappears from circulation in this way, the most troubling difficulties arise for commerce and for the life of the people in general. Spain, which was virtually flooded with precious metals after the discovery of America, still experienced a severe shortage in the supply of coins, because a large portion of these metals immediately flowed abroad due to the unfavorable trade balance, while another portion was processed and hoarded in the homes of the wealthy as well as in churches and monasteries. In response, Philip III issued an edict in 1600 that not only prohibited the export of metal money but also ordered that all gold and silver artifacts within the country be surrendered and minted into coins. When this failed to achieve the desired effect, an equally fruitless attempt was made to alleviate the situation by introducing a debased sign money. The fact that European coins find it relatively difficult to gain acceptance as a regular means of payment in primitive societies is closely related to the inclination to use precious metals for ornamental purposes and to regard the form in which these circulate in commerce as unimportant. Weighing indeed allows for more than just a precise determination of value. In some ways this method is even preferable to our own, which allows worn coins to circulate at par alongside newly minted ones. Above all, weighing does not permanently fix the value ratios between the different monetary metals and thus better preserves money's inherent quality as a medium of exchange as well as its transactability, and thereby prevents too painful feelings about shifts in relative value. This also explains why even civilized nations have sometimes only hesitantly decided to adopt money coined from precious metals, or even avoided it altogether. In ancient Rome, only silver was minted in notable amounts, while gold, despite being the primary means of payment, circulated in uncoined pieces and was weighed like any other commodity during transactions. To this day, China has only small change made from base metal and no official gold and silver coins. If the system of weighing, unlike the assurance provided by the stamp of a reputable government, did not have the disadvantage of only being able to determine the quantity, but not the quality of the metal, it might have asserted itself even more tenaciously. If no value is attached to the minting of coins but only to the quantity of metal, then the individual coins usually prove to be too large so that small quantities cannot be weighed with sufficient accuracy, and there is a general resort to break them into small and irregular pieces. This gives rise to hack silver, the primary means of payment in many regions of the world, including previously in Eastern Europe and even in Germany, wherever Slavs resided within its borders. Large amounts of hack silver also circulate in China alongside silver bars and Mexican dollars, reaching westward to the borders with Russia. It was also previously found in South Asia. Meanwhile, Madagascar stands out as a completely independent small region with hack silver. Once primitive societies recognize the merits of a particular minted coin, however, they cling to it with an iron-like insistence, since trust is based on the design of the coin that is, by convention, considered to be the only valid one. Perhaps the most peculiar example is the Maria Theresa thaler. Shortly after the coin's first appearance, some pieces reached the Orient and the Eastern Sahel, initially just as an adornment and possibly because the bust portrait of the opulently built empress appealed to Oriental tastes. Gradually, the thaler spread to Abyssinia, the Eastern and Central Sahel, the East African coast beyond Zanzibar, and Western Arabia. The coin's intricate details are well known and always considered during transactions. New coins with the old design are still minted en masse, especially in Vienna, and exported to Africa, but they often have to be artificially aged to be successfully handed over to the locals. To make smaller denominations, the thaler is cut into regularly divided pieces, which, unlike hack silver, are obviously not weighed. The importation of thalers has recently been banned in Zanzibar and along the East African coast, and with the coin now largely demonetized, it is often only accepted at its pure silver value. Other silver coins have also conquered a vast territory of circulation, notably the Mexican silver dollar and the Spanish thaler, which is directly related to the large silver production of these countries. Recently, the Indian rupee has been making inroads on various fronts, including into East Africa and Tibet, where it is popular because Chinese merchants are known to deceive in the most shameless way when weighing silver. The rupee is also frequently divided into pieces. In primitive societies, gold primarily circulates in regions where it is abundantly available and typically appears in the form of dust and grains, panned from the sands of rivers and streams and weighed during transactions. Here and there, gold has remained a mere commodity, but as a rule it swiftly and decisively joins the ranks of monetary instruments. When it does so, it often maintains a certain prestige and is typically not used to purchase large quantities of low-quality goods but only exchanged for particularly beautiful or precious things. Gold dust has apparently been a common form of money on the Gold Coast and in Ashanti since ancient times, with gold scales and weights displaying particularly interesting designs. Gold dust also circulates in Indonesia, China, and formerly in ancient Mexico as well. The so-called fetish gold of the Gold Coast, however, was cast into specific figures that most probably used to possess some mystical significance, thereby enhancing their value through their form. This did not prevent this particular gold from being heavily adulterated or from being broken into pieces for smaller payments. With regards to primitive contexts, copper must categorically be placed among the ornamental metals despite the fact that it is always also used for practical objects, which gives it a somewhat ambivalent status. And although the tremendous production of copper in civilized nations has extremely devalued it, the ancient Roman copper currency, even as it transitioned from weight-based to coined money, could not be sustained in the long run. The more the value of copper plummeted, the larger and larger the quantities became that were necessary to make payments, and it became less and less convenient to use the metal as a medium of exchange. In contrast, both indigenous and imported copper in various forms is still widely used as money in Africa. Especially remarkable are the cross-shaped copper pieces from Katanga, which circulate as money in a large part of the southern Congo basin and are known as handa, weighing between 2 to 3 pounds, as well as the copper rods which circulate around Stanley Pool according to Lenz, or the copper rings along the middle Congo, which European traders unsuccessfully tried to substitute with imported copper-plated iron rings. Among the Azand, copper rings of various sizes crafted from rods circulated as small change. Because it was apparently too devalued, the iron money which was common in Boni on the west coast has recently been replaced by a similarly shaped copper money sourced from England, while the copper currency in Bornu was driven out by the silver thaler and cowries. The copper plates of the Northwest Americans have already been cited in a different context above. Knife-shaped copper money is said to still exist in the Beijing area. What can be said of copper applies broadly, with the obvious exception of iron, to the other base metals that were or still are sporadically used as money in commerce, such as tin, which circulated in ring form in Darfur, in the form of plates in ancient Mexico, or was minted into coins in Java and some small areas of South Asia. Small sheets of zinc circulate in Cambodia as do lead coins in the shape of stars or flowers in Siam and zinc coins in China. Generally, the different base metals and their alloys have been extensively used to produce small coins in China and Indochina. In primitive societies, these coins then, however, only serve as ornaments. As an addendum to and inversion of the transformation of European coins into ornaments, it should be noted that the coins of civilized nations are often imitated by uncivilized tribes. Perhaps because something mysterious and important is seen in them and the reason for their appreciation is not well understood. There are many such barbarian coins from classical antiquity. They were particularly common among the Germanic tribes, serving as mere ornaments and maybe also as amulets. In recent times, South African natives have made crude replicas of English coins. As these do not actually circulate as money but are stored away, they are rather like valuable curiosities which chiefs occasionally give to their followers as gifts. Here, too, it is remarkable how metal money, in primitive societies, has the tendency to revert to its ornamental origins. 12. Clothes and fabric money. While it is already uncertain whether monies crafted from base metals should belong to the concept of ornament money or to that of use money, this uncertainty might be even more justified with respect to clothes and fabric money. Clothes have been made to serve very different purposes over time, most of which do not facilitate the transformation of fabrics into means of payment, but two specific purposes legitimately stand out in this regard. As clothes conceal the body and shield it from the elements, they are extremely useful and their utility determines their value. But as they provide the body, as it were, with a new surface the sight of which can either be pleasing or unappealing, and as adornments that once belonged directly to the body must now be represented on and through clothes, they become ornamental and subject to an appreciation of a totally different kind. Considering the immense significance of adornment in primitive societies, we can assume that the ornamental traits of clothes always play a more or less significant role when they are used as money. However, since the simplest kind of clothing money, fur money, has most clearly been developed among the tribes of the cold zone, the appreciation of its practical value undoubtedly is of utmost importance in that case. The practice of using the skins of highly valued fur-bearing animals as a means of payment surged wherever European trade began to exploit fur-rich regions. In many instances, the emergence of fur money might indeed be attributed to this trade alone. This could be particularly true for Siberia, where the natives had to pay tributes partly in furs but also among the North American natives, where a proper fur money likely came into being only through the fur trade as well, although rudimentary forms might have existed before. While northern tribes used beaver pelts as their unit of value, southern tribes used those of raccoons, and the Missouri tribes tanned buffalo hides, which were used as a measure of value and a means of exchange, at least in their encounters with traders. The Northwest Americans, among whom the concept of money was more developed than among other tribes, considered sea otter pelts as a unit of value and the foundation of wealth, while the same can be said of reindeer hides among the Tlingit. Fur money in its typical form once existed in northern European societies, for instance in Scandinavia and among the Russians who, as already mentioned, put, instead of large and unwieldy furs, a sign money into circulation that was made from small, stamped pieces of fur. On the Faroe Islands, sheepskin functioned as a kind of imaginary unit of value that was used for calculating, although the skins themselves did not circulate physically. Where the influence of European culture on indigenous people intensifies, the old fur clothing often disappears in colder areas and gives way to woolen blankets, which are then not only used for bartering but also hoarded in great quantities by the natives as their most valuable property. In Northwest America, woolen blankets introduced by the Hudson Bay Company have displaced fur money. There are 4 varieties which are marked by points, with one of them acting as the unit of value used for calculation. Similar conditions are found among many Native American tribes in the United States. Nearly as primitive a clothing material as fur, bark only rarely appears as a type of money despite its broad distribution. Although tappa takes on many of the tasks of a typical inside money in Polynesia, as it is accumulated as valuable property as well as used for tribute and the payment of fines, it cannot be called money in the proper sense. Stallman reports that small pieces of bark cloth once circulated as money in Uganda. As Uganda is an area where garments made from bark cloth prevailed originally and as it is possible to combine individual pieces into larger ones, this might in fact be a case of pure use money. On the other hand, bark is so cheap that these small pieces might better be considered sign money. Cloths woven out of palm fibers, which used to circulate along the Longo coast and the lower Congo and were initially thought of as a type of use money, also gradually became sign money before disappearing from commerce altogether. In regions where an actual textile industry developed and where fabrics are produced in large quantities, such as in ancient Mexico, the foundation for the emergence of fabric money is laid. Among the oldest types of money in China are small pieces of linen and silk fabric of specific size, although later on neither are any longer mentioned as means of payment. Cotton fabrics are still used as money only in Tibet, and the most saleable are those that are stamped, that is, in a sense, minted by the Chinese Customs Administration. In ancient Japan, fabrics appear alongside grain as regular tax payments, as in ancient Mexico, and gifts of textiles are also mentioned as payments for poets. Compulsory labor services could be cancelled out by paying dues in cloth and rice. Whether these initial conditions led to true fabric money remains an open question. At present, the most evident use of fabric money occurs in the Sahel, mainly using a domestically produced cotton cloth alongside which cotton yarn occasionally makes an appearance. In Bornu, where originally a copper currency dominated, strips of cotton of a specific size were introduced as money, until cowrie shells were accepted as small change. Red-dyed strips of cotton were once in circulation as money in Fezzan as well. Along the West African coast, even Europeans often used the local fabrics as a means of exchange and a measure of value because they were cheaper and more popular than European textiles. The natives in this region indeed display a resolute inclination to consistently hold on to those familiar fabrics, the value of which they are clearly aware, thereby endowing them with one of the main traits of an ideal money, a stable market value. The Moors in northern Senegambia accept, for instance, only the dark blue Indian calicos, pieces de Guinea, as payment for their gum and can distinguish it from all imitations by its smell. In the central and western Sahel, we come across the peculiarity that it is often not just pieces of fabric of a certain size that circulate but rather finished garments, especially the shirt-like turban, which is the national dress of the Islamic population there. Among the Missouri tribes in America, pants are one of the measures of value, as are war cloaks among the Maasai and boots in Tibet. In earlier times, European woven fabrics occasionally served as money within the countries they originated from, such as, for instance, linen pieces on Rugen and woolen and other textiles in Scandinavia. The easily divisible cloth, Money became a popular form of small change alongside livestock money throughout the Nordic countries, with the L length of a standard cloth becoming a kind of monetary unit to which other types of cloth, livestock, and pieces of unminted metal stood in a stable value ratio. However, European fabrics gained their significance as measures of value only when they were introduced to less civilized tribes through trade, especially among African indigenous peoples. Cotton fabrics are the medium of exchange that is least likely to be rejected, probably because the concepts of use money and ornament money are most intimately combined and mutually reinforce each other in this case. As soon as the ornamental element starts to dominate their appreciation, capricious shifts in fashion emerge, which only gradually transform into the more durable form of custom, obviously even more slowly the more plentiful and manifold the foreign fabrics flowing into a country are. As already noted, we everywhere observe the ambition to separate out certain fabrics as stable measures of value and to withdraw them from the variable judgment of taste, thereby creating a proper fabric money. In Unyamwezi, for example, many kinds of fabrics are traded, but only the type known as Bombay circulates as money. Clothes are also able to express a person's rank and importance. This aspect seems to have contributed to the idea in Oriental societies that the possession of many garments symbolizes power and wealth, and when rulers, along these lines, hoarded vast reserves of garments and gifted them to their followers, they gave clothes a new value and used them as a kind of money. Old Armenian sources refer to the administrator of the magician's robes as well as to the administrator of the clothes of Segistan as court officials. The Bible speaks of the keeper of the wardrobe, and in the book of Job, we find the phrase, though he, the atheist, heaps up silver like dust and clothes like piles of clay, what he lays up the righteous will wear, and the innocent will divide his silver. 13. Use money, food and stimulants. The entire evolution of inside money shows that objects of purely practical use will only be embraced as inside money as an exception, least of all those that satisfy the most immediate needs of human existence, food. It can, however, be posited that the broad category of use money also includes some types of food, because food will either partially or completely drop out of common ownership following the development of the concept of property, after which edible items can be used as outside money as much as any other commodity. The number would be even greater if food was not perishable and if many types of food were not so ill-suited for small-scale hand-to-hand transactions, not to mention the inevitable contamination caused by this, which children and indigenous people quite guilelessly overlook. In any case, and like all types of use money, food has an intrinsic value which, under certain circumstances, prompts members of civilized nations to invest their wealth in consumable things or other commodities instead of holding on to the devalued sign money of a bankrupt state. This happened in Sweden during the introduction of their notorious sign money, as well as in France during the time of the swindler, John Law, and again during the French Revolution when assignats became waste paper. Mr. von Grimm, whose agent did not receive the news in time, got nothing but a Brussels lace collar for several 100,000 francs in assignats, as noted by Goethe. In his unusual treatise, The Closed Commercial State, Fichte recommends the introduction of a pure sign money for his self-sufficient ideal state but proposes grain as the measure of value. He could have referred to the fact that grain has indeed often been used in this way, as well as in the form of an actual transactable currency such as in Denmark and elsewhere in Northern Europe in former times. The remuneration of certain officials, especially the clergy, often still consists of grain and other food which is only gradually replaced by money. In China, a large portion of taxes are collected in the form of rice, which in turn is paid out to officials as part of their salary, about half of it during the previous century. Livestock and grain were the most important monetary instruments of the Javanese in older times. Maize kernels circulated as small change in Mexico. Durra, sorghum, measured by hand or in containers, was used as money in Suakin and other parts of the eastern Sahel, with port fees also levied in Durra. In eastern Indonesia, sago replaces grain and also serves as a means of payment. Formerly, for example, in the Moluccas and currently still in the Gulf of Papua. Among tree fruits, dates have to be mentioned, which are occasionally used as small change in Persia and Somaliland, and walnuts which often have to serve as small change in Tibet. Food of animal origin generally spoils even more easily than plant products, but some have been temporarily established as a monetary instrument, such as stockfish in Iceland, where it formed a measure of value alongside an ell of fabric, cheese in Lapland, and, among other things, chicken eggs. Non-essential foods or stimulants are used as money far more frequently than basic foodstuffs. Just like fabric money, the types of money that arise in this way are not pure use money, which explains the immense preference for them. Just as hoarded ornaments seem to trigger endless visions of joy, so too do abundantly available stimulants which are not supposed to satisfy mere needs and whose possession therefore, more easily than the possession of other things, awakens a sense of wealth and freedom. A well-stocked wine cellar has a different effect on the imagination than one that is 10 times larger but full of potatoes and turnips. This is why money made from stimulants maintains its relevance with much tenacity or revives itself time and again. The term trinkgeld, tip, literally drink money, which has been reduced to signify nothing more than a semi-voluntary payment for services, already suggests that it was originally supposed to replace the gift of an actual drink, and that it was still assumed that the recipient would soon convert the money into some kind of liquor. Lately it can be observed everywhere that cigars, which are sufficiently durable, easily transportable, and almost always welcome stimulants, are being given out in place of trinkgeld. Tobacco is also the most favored type of small change in many societies that have come under European influence, such as sticks of tobacco in Australia and the South Sea, where they are only refused on the Admiralty Islands. Schweinfurth's illustrations show African tobacco money. Bricks of tobacco circulate as money on Nias, and tobacco leaves in the hinterland of Liberia. The fact that tobacco sometimes substituted for the scarce small change in the early United States, and was even legal tender in Virginia, is detailed by Elwoff. Another monetary instrument is, unfortunately, liquor, which, primarily introduced by Europeans, represents more than a mere trade good, particularly in West Africa. Alongside cotton fabrics, it serves as the general means of payment along the Longo coast. According to Falkenstein, an egg costs a full glass of rum in the dry season and half a glass in the rainy season. A goat is priced at 4-6 pieces of cloth and 2-3 bottles of rum, 750 milliliters each. This phenomenon has, by the way, a parallel in East Asia. The Japanese supply the Ainu on Izo with large amounts of rice wine and use it for all minor payments to the natives, who are not allowed to be in possession of metal money. The Ainu therefore give the rice wine the ironic name official milk. The even more destructive opium seems to circulate as money on Hainan. Far more widespread is the harmless tea brick, which is produced in China and serves both as a stimulant and as money in Tibet and Mongolia. For the latter purpose, it is sometimes divided into smaller pieces. At the time when the Jesuit missions were flourishing, Paraguay tea was a substitute for money in Paraguay and also used to pay taxes. It has already been noted that cocoa beans were a popular small change among the Central Americans in pre-Columbian times, and it has to be mentioned that betel nuts in the East Indies and cola nuts in the Sahel replace money occasionally. It is symptomatic that the cola nut remains the most popular gift even in areas where it does not have an actual money value, suggesting that it most probably developed out of a gratuity, trinkgeld, to form a proper small change. Spices seem rarely to be used as money and can mostly be found in the central Sahel, where Nachtigal observed that red pepper, kimber, onions, and garlic served as small change. Stewart mentions bitter almonds as the smallest denomination in the western Sahel. Only one spice forms a splendid exception: salt. The need for salt among people whose main diet consists of vegetables, especially among the blacks of Africa, is so great that it has given rise to migrations and wars, and people attempt, in many different ways, to make common salt or a substitute for it from the ashes of certain plants and even from cattle young. Salt is therefore an extremely popular commodity all over Africa, but it only serves as money in the proper sense in specific regions, notably in Abyssinia, where it is commercialized in whetstone-like pieces. It is wrapped with a strip of bark that, so to speak, represents its minting. During his stay in Abyssinia, Alvarez found this salt money already serving as the national currency, which, unsurprisingly, gained a higher value the further one moved away from the place of production. This is a trait that salt money shares with all outside money that is sourced from a specific region and can therefore only dominate a certain area surrounding its place of production, beyond which the transport costs excessively inflate the price of the substance, or competition from other points of production makes itself felt. Where a block of salt is highly valued, the phrase "he eats salt" has become common and expresses the idea that he is wealthy or lives off his money. Salt blocks are also a popular money in the Western Sahel and the Sahara. In Samatigala, a slave could be purchased for 30 pieces. Salt is also the preferred means of exchange in southern Wade. Whetstone-like salt pieces woven in reed, similar to those in Abyssinia, are used as money by the Kisama in Angola, while Lenz mentions salt as a measure of value among the Fang. Marco Polo gave a detailed report about a type of salt money that circulated alongside uncoined gold in southwestern China. They have salt which they boil and set in a mold flat below and round above, and every piece from the mold weighs about half a pound. Now, 80 molds of this salt are worth 1 sagio of fine gold, which is a weight so called. On the money so made the prince's mark is printed, and no one is allowed to make it except the royal officers. And merchants take this currency and go to those tribes that dwell among the mountains of those parts in the wildest and most unfrequented quarters, and there they get a sagio of gold for 60, or 50, or 40 pieces of this salt money, in proportion as the natives are more barbarous and more remote from towns and civilized folk. Petrus Martyr reports about salt money circulating around the Caribbean Sea during the Age of Exploration. 14. Iron money. The mass production of iron by the civilized nations of Europe has depressed the value of the most useful of all metals extremely, so that the thought of using it as money must seem almost grotesque to us. However, in many indigenous societies, it is still rare and precious enough to be used for this purpose, and is indeed a very widespread and popular money. Primitive iron money appears in the most varied forms, which can, however, easily be classified into two major groups. The first group includes differently shaped pieces of iron, such as bars, rods, and the like, which embody only the metal value and whose shape somewhat substitutes for a minting process. To the second group belong the iron tools that serve a practical purpose and circulate as money at the same time, so that the blacksmith's work increases the metal value. Since these tools can easily be recast into other shapes, they prove to be a very suitable medium of circulation, preferable to the actual bars. Despite their high estimation, both groups of iron money are to be categorized as use money, even if the concept becomes ambiguous at times. The few examples of iron ornament money that can still be observed today do not, of course, belong here. Although Africa is the main region of iron money today, it also frequently circulated in Europe during antiquity. The ancient Greek volos, a bolus, was originally an iron rod or maybe a spearhead, in any case a distinctly shaped iron money, which was displaced by silver money early on. It was only retained in the conservative Sparta, striving to close itself from the outside, but it declined into a type of sign money and regressed from an originally widely used means of payment into a typical inside money whose use value was completely destroyed by a specific treatment of the iron. Furthermore, it soon changed form and received the more convenient disc shape of other coins. Among the Britons, Caesar found iron and copper rods as money. On Asian soil, iron money in the form of elongated flat rods is still found today in Cambodia. In the past, the Chinese government also issued iron money because there was a lack of copper, but it was replaced by the easier to handle paper money. These iron coins, which, by the way, are still found in Tibet today, are best assigned to the group of sign money. Iron coins, likely inspired by the Chinese case, also circulated in ancient Japan. Africa's extraordinary wealth in iron ore might be the main reason why the iron industry has spread throughout almost all of Africa, while so many other seeds of civilization either withered away or only developed in a stunted form in this barren region. However, ore resources are not evenly distributed, so the rewarding task of spreading the indispensable metal to all places falls to trade, which ultimately elevates iron to the rank of outside money and even of money in the full sense of the word. Yet, we should consider the fact that in various regions many blacksmiths have to pay their taxes in the form of iron tools. This practice serves as a starting point for the development of inside money. It is not possible here to cite let alone to critically examine the countless references to African iron money, but it is also not necessary because we do not aim to provide a very detailed picture of its geographical distribution. The most important and best corroborated cases shall be highlighted, making use of the above-mentioned division into two groups. Burckhardt reports that raw pieces of iron circulated as money in Kordofan, while, according to Ruppel's information, a government-issued iron money circulated which had a shape more or less similar to a small anchor. Iron rods were the most important measures of value in Senegambia, where the term bar expressed the quantity of any commodity the value of which corresponded to that of an iron rod. 20 rolls of tobacco leaves were referred to as a bar of tobacco, and a gallon of spirits, likewise, as a bar of rum. Here, in a very interesting way, one of those originally real, then imaginary, measures of value developed, as already mentioned above. Page 84. The bar, like the similar bar in Sierra Leone, gradually lost its original meaning and European merchants finally equated it with the value of 2 shillings. Another type of iron money was used on the Gold Coast, a sort of large iron pin with a semicircle at the end, which circulated as small change around 1600. The shape probably had no practical purpose, just like the horseshoe-shaped form of the iron money formerly used in Bonny. The Fang have elongated, blade-shaped iron pieces that circulate in bundles of 8 to 10 pieces. Besides these, there are also various similar types of iron money in the Gabon region, such as bell-shaped iron pieces bundled in fours, biki, or snail-shaped pieces, maaha, tied up in the same way, as well as iron bars and arrowhead, like iron pieces bound together, of which the Bremen Museum possesses a sample. Lenz probably refers to this type of iron money when he speaks of thin rods about 6 inches in length, which are tagged at the top with a kind of flag and combined in bundles of 10 to 20 pieces. The Yondo in the hinterland of Cameroon use small iron rods, flattened at both ends, as money, but mainly for the purchase of wives. Especially large iron bars circulate along the lower Congo. The curious iron spades of the Bongo mark a transition from the first to the second group. Although their shape suggests an originally practical purpose, it no longer quite fits this purpose, particularly the log ocolati depicted by Schweinfurth and André with an anchor-like extension. They are thus almost exclusively used as money and hoarded in large quantities by the wealthy. Comparable things must have occurred in the case of the shovel-shaped iron money that, according to Alvars, circulated in Angat, Abyssinia, and was, despite its shape, only used as a means of payment. The most essential tool of African agriculture, the hoe, has become a means of payment in many areas, alongside which many other types of money circulated. We find it as money among the Bari, as tribute payments from the subjugated tribes to the Makalolo in South Africa, and as a toll collected in Ugogo. The hoes, gem, made southwest of Lake Victoria, of which about 150,000 pieces appear on the market in Tabora annually, are, as Sigel writes, carried by all caravans as the best trade object for procuring food throughout Ugogo and even close to the coast. However, the major area of circulation for the iron hoe is the Upper Congo, especially the area around Stanley Falls and the Lualaba River up to Lake Albert. Shovels which have not yet been alienated from their practical purpose circulate in the hinterland of Delagoa Bay, to where they were previously exported en masse from Europe. Iron shovels also once circulated as money in Calabar on the west coast. Iron in the form of weapons is too important to not also become a means of trade. According to Nachtigal's testimony, the throwing knife was the only money that the idolatrous tribes of Bajirmi accepted when trading grain. Iron spears, assegais, were originally the preferred money of the Xhosa tribes of South Africa, but spearheads also serve as a measure of value in some places in northeast Africa. The Haya on the southwest shore of Lake Victoria use spearheads and iron hoes for their external and cowries for their internal trade, which, by the way, is a very good example of how inside and outside money can exist side by side without affecting each other. Spearheads also circulate among the Luwo on the Upper Nile, and, at the Upper Congo near Stanley Falls, Lenz found massive bundles of 1.5 to 2 foot long iron spearheads, which represented a specific value and circulated as money. Iron weapons as money can also be found in Indonesia. On Roti Island, knives circulate as a means of payment, and on the Nassau Islands near Sumatra, the iron axe serves as a measure of value, which, like the knife, is also a tool of peaceful activity. European imports occasionally give rise to new forms of iron money which, however, usually do not become permanent arrangements. While the desire for hoop iron has subsided among the societies of the South Seas, initially everything could be bought with it and all commercial transactions could be settled with hoop iron and nails on. For example, the Marianas. It may have also been a good time to be a trader in Kamchatka when the natives still placed pieces of iron on poles in front of their homes as symbols of great wealth. Needles and nails seem to have often been used as loose change, the latter particularly in more recent times along the upper Benue River and elsewhere in Africa. 15. Other types of use money. The development of use money from barter and trade inevitably implies that the boundaries between money and commodity are never clear-cut and that transformations and regressions are not uncommon. A commodity can, for example, temporarily serve as real money only to hand over this role to another material without disappearing from commercial transactions. All reports on use money should, therefore, be treated with a certain caution, although it is not always possible to provide a critical frame for these reports. As stated several times before, it is anyhow not the purpose of our brief treatise to compartmentalize things into sharply delineated categories. Sharp boundaries between individual phenomena, as already mentioned, do not exist in the realm of anthropology, and it is irrelevant under which concept we discuss an object once we have clarity about its position in the sequence of the overall development. With these reservations in mind, we may list a few things that come close to or truly correspond to the term use money. Among the objects that humans first separate from communal ownership as their personal property, besides ornaments, are weapons, and it is undoubtedly the labor used in their production, creating a new, in a certain sense, artistic form which drives and explains this process. One should, furthermore, not forget the particularly close relationship humans have with their weapons. But the group of weapon money could not develop in the same exemplary way as ornament money did, above all because weapons are objects of practical use and therefore too exposed to the interventions of communism, and because they are, more or less, difficult to handle. This latter trait explains why weapons mainly appear as valuable property and, therefore, as a medium to pay fines or tributes with, but rarely as the small change of commerce, which, in any case, is often managed by women who are generally unfamiliar with weapons. For the ancient Germanic people, weapons, particularly body armor, were the most important property. Surrendering the latter could avert corporal punishment or enable the acquisition of women and slaves, but they would not be used as objects of everyday trade. The same applies to Homer's Greeks. The Mongols also held such ideas during their bellicose period when they conquered half of the world, their weapons and livestock being their wealth. The legal codes of the Kalmyks from that era frequently have chiefs imposing fines of 100 armors, 100 camels, and 1,000 horses for severe misdeeds. In contrast, small and widely used weapons might at times circulate as small change, especially arrows and arrowheads. On the Banks Islands, delicately shaped wooden arrows once circulated instead of the currently common pearls and, at least as an initial form of weapon money. One can note that the aka Pygmies of Central Africa purchased brides from their parents for a certain number of arrows, stone arrowheads, which Manchuria used to pay as part of its tribute in former times, might have often played the role of money in prehistoric times but have now been displaced by other weapons to an extent that such uses can no longer be observed. Instead, where European imports make their mark, gunpowder, bullets, and rifles readily join the ranks of primitive monetary instruments, in Borneo even, as already mentioned in another context, in the form of bronze cannons. It is hardly worth listing all the other European trinkets that fashion has here and there elevated to a popular means of payment. It may be mentioned that in Bonny, empty glass bottles circulated as a generally accepted currency with which one could purchase food and works of art in the market. Similarly, small glass mirrors, razors, flint stones, and the like, are very common. Valued medicinal products also occasionally appear as a circulating money. Kraft found blue vitriol, which was very popular among the natives, circulating as a kind of coin in use. Ambara, camphor, which is also attributed with magical powers, seems to be used as money in parts of the central Sahel, and ambergris appears as one of the means of payment in Senegambia and the upper Niger region. Beeswax cakes served as money in various uncivilized tribes in Indonesia, as did benzoin cakes. Beeswax money was also in use among the native tribes along the Amazon, and, Finally, European writing paper should be mentioned, which manages to function as a real money in the Central Sahel, because it is not imported in great amounts and is frequently used in the Islamic parts of the region. It is reminiscent of the already discussed custom of the Dayaks who store and invest their wealth in ancient Chinese porcelain vases considered to be sacred, that the Lemba in the Transvaal use clay pots as a kind of outside money, while the large vases of the Dayaks do not properly circulate as currency. Chinese porcelain bowls fulfill the functions of a true money in southern Mindanao, for not only are they used for the purchase of brides and are hung up as signs of wealth in huts, but they also take the place of coins in transactions. We have already discussed the two types of use money that are most important, livestock and slave money, and pointed out that they cannot simply be placed in the same category as the others. Here it may also be noted that, apart from herd animals and meat animals, other animals can also be used as a kind of money. For example, domesticated forest birds among the indigenous people of Guyana, or chickens that are not eaten and therefore have a purely conventional value among Brazilian tribes. Separating ornament from use money enables the establishment of at least some order within the chaos of primitive types of money, although one must always bear in mind that squeezing things into prefabricated templates contradicts the very essence of anthropological phenomena. Such general schemes, therefore, always remain crude and do not reveal the delicate roots of the whole development, and, for this reason, would have to be completely rejected if it was not necessary to gain a preliminary overview. The opinion that anthropology should merely collect and accumulate material for decades to come, and that the intellectual apprehension of the collected material should carefully be avoided, is not acceptable at all. If mere collection was as straightforward and self-evident as some make it seem, then the material, which allegedly still provides an insufficient basis for further research, would already have been abundantly brought together. In reality, it is the theoretical analysis that helps us to recognize the problems and points us to the ways in which they can be solved. It poses those questions that the pure empiricist does not answer because he is not even aware of them. The attempt presented here, as little as it has managed to exhaust the subject, might in this sense at least help to clarify what the problems are. 16. Monetary systems and value ratios. An overview summarizing the types of money used by primitive societies, in the way it has been given here, sheds light upon quite a number of facts, but it can, on the other hand, easily lead to the false conclusion that the number of measures of value is extraordinarily large everywhere and their relation poorly defined. Alongside this overview, a detailed description of all the monetary systems that different societies and tribes developed from ornament and use money, should be provided for the sake of completeness. However, this task would be difficult to accomplish even in a comprehensive work, not to mention the scarcity and unreliability of the current literature on these issues. The emergence of specific internal monetary systems is always supported by the inclination to transform outside money into inside money, and to employ money not to facilitate external trade, as one might assume according to common theories, but rather to obstruct it. Along these lines, for instance, a ban on the mining and panning of gold existed in Korea, because this universally desired precious metal promoted and stimulated trade with foreign countries in an unwanted way, ultimately culminating in complete isolation from the outside world. Japan adhered to similar principles for a long time. The fact that in previous centuries every small state strove to have its own monetary system and its own special combination of the weight and fineness of coins, and that even today a single monetary union cannot be achieved, can also be traced back to the desire to create an invisible commercial border around the country and to prevent objects of value from flowing back and forth too quickly. This principle also guided Russia's past favoring of barter over monetary transactions at its borders, attempting to keep precious metals within the country. It thus occurs that the means of exchange for external trade join the ranks of inside money and find their place within the different systems, while, elsewhere, inside money, on its own, generates a range of measures that serve to evaluate both smaller and larger quantities of goods. Primitive types of money suffer much more than precious metals from the difficulty that not every type of money is suitable for all purposes. While one can use one type to express the smallest values, it cannot be used for large payments due to the low value of the material. Conversely, the precious types are unsuitable for small-scale transactions. Here and there, monetary systems develop in regular and logical ways, but in most cases a kind of struggle takes place between the measures of value originating from different sources, which ultimately ends in a settlement. Estimation of value is carried out in very different and often curious ways. A few examples of primitive monetary systems may explain what has just been said. Two of the most intricate systems, implemented with great ingenuity, are the already mentioned ones from the Caroline Islands of Yap and the Palau Islands, both of which Kuberi describes in detail. There, the sets of money are composed of very different elements that have been brought into relation with one another, but, at least on the Palau Islands, their sheer number and the artificially increased difficulties of estimation caused the emergence of a simple measure of value, namely a basket of taro, that is, a specific quantity of the main type of food. Among the types of money on Yap, there is, first of all, an old shell money, GAU, whose few available strings do not enter into circulation, as the strings are decorated with sperm whale teeth at both ends. These teeth have also attained a certain value without developing into real money. The second type of money consists of round aragonite stone discs perforated in the middle, the value of which is calculated according to the diameter in handspans, but which has declined sharply since the import of numerous pieces by Europeans. The simple estimation by handspans and the existence of large and small pieces enabled a fairly accurate determination of value, while the unwieldiness of this stone money prevents its general use in small transactions. Mother-of-pearl shells strung on thread circulate as small change in the proper sense. During payments, commodities of various kinds, that is, outside money, are often added to the proper monies. The system of the Palau Islands is far more intricate. Here money is composed of old pearls and fragments of glass and baked earth. As their number and diversity are so extraordinarily large and only few completely identical pieces exist, it is almost impossible to give a clear overview. Kuberi divides the various types, which each have their own names, into three main groups according to the quality of the material, which are, in turn, broken down into subgroups. As already mentioned, none of these monies is the actual measure of value, a role taken over by the basket of taro, or, more accurately, by the total of 10 baskets. The natives, writes Kuberi, have a very precise system, a scale, whose starting point is a piece of money regardless of its quality, as long as it can pay for 10 baskets of taro. The unit of 10 baskets of taro, each having to contain about 60 smaller or 30-40 large roots, is called morakemo, goes for 10, from where the following scale results, which, admittedly, does not give a very clear picture due to Kuberi's somewhat unclear phrasing. 1. Morakemo equals 10 baskets of taro. 2. Honiakal is almost the double of 1. If of full value, the piece is called matal adalobok, so 2 times 1. 3. Adalobok equals the sum of the two previous ones, so 3 times 1. 4. Matal akluk is again higher by 1 morakemo, so 4 times 1. 5. Kluk equals the sum of matal akluk and adalobok, so 7 times 1. 6. Ekota kelkal is a piece valued at more than 1 but less than 2 kluks. 7. Kalebakal is worth up to 5 kluks. As one can see, the value measurement using the unit of 10 baskets of taro is systematically applied only at the lower levels, and Kuberi's terminology, which apparently corresponds to the ideas of the natives, allows us to realize that one does not multiply the unit but that higher values are achieved by the simple addition of lower ones. This style of calculation might be further clarified by looking at a value system from another area of the world, which illustrates even better how an existing unit of value is not used continuously but only serves as the starting point of a strange system of addition. Among the natives of the Missouri region, the knife was the smallest unit of calculation at the time that Kurtz resided in their land, and the system based on it was the following. 2 knives equals 1 pair of leggings. 2 knives and 1 pair of leggings equals 1 blanket. 2 knives, 1 pair of leggings and 1 blanket equals 1 rifle. The preceding ones and 1 gun equals 1 horse. The preceding ones and 1 horse equals 1 leather tent. The preceding ones and 1 leather tent equals 1 woman. Currency is relatively uniform in that part of New Britain where the shell money called diwara circulates. The money, threaded on strings, is measured in arm lengths. The measure from the tip of the index finger to the elbow is called a tiroya, From the fingertip to the shoulder a willowy, and a man's full arm span is a pacorno or param, derived from the English word fathom. A pig cost 6-9 fathoms in 1881. The fine for murdering an ordinary man was 50 fathoms, and 20 pieces of tobacco could be exchanged for 1 fathom. The natives typically do not like it when Europeans acquire diwara and thereby reduce the amount of available inside money, and, as a result, a kind of outside money has developed from the barter trade, especially in the form of tobacco. The conditions on the Solomon Islands, where very interesting forms of inside money exist alongside each other, are not as well documented. Codrington only mentions that a dog tooth corresponds in value to 5 porpoise teeth on the Florida Islands, while on San Cristobal it only takes 1-2 of the latter to compensate the former. The feather money from the Santa Cruz Islands is stored in pieces about 15 feet long, with shorter lengths serving as small change. Shell money from the Florida Islands is also divided into strings with specific lengths. 6 strings are called a rongo, 10 rongas an isa, and it seems that red and white shell money are used interchangeably without making a distinction. It is different on Isabel according to Coote, who offers the following table. 10 coconuts equals 1 string of white shell money or 1 piece of tobacco. 10 strings of white shell money equals 1 string of red shell money or 1 dog tooth. 10 strings of red shell money equals 1 isa or 50 porpoise teeth. 10 isis equals 1 good quality wife. 1 marble ring. Bakaha equals 1 head. Among the headhunters,